back to another episode of That's What That Was presents The Flow Is Yours. Now, in this episode, we're gonna make it a little bit different. This time, it is a tournament edition of The Flow Is Yours. By that, I mean, in the last few episodes, as you saw, it wasn't very competitive. It was just a first, second, and third best pick at the end. But this time, it's a proper competition, round by round. Well, let me explain. So, 8 teams at the start, 4 and 4 in 2 preliminary rounds. 2 qualify from each, and they meet at the finals. They compete to be the first, second, and third best teams of the Flow Is Yours first ever tournament edition. Now, these speakers comprise of very, very capable debaters and MUNers of the Indian under 20 circuit. Now, you must be wondering, if they're so highly credentialed in the circuit and highly regarded, they must require highly regarded judges. Well, heads up, we got them for you. By that I mean, we have 2 brilliant judges by the name of Indrajeet and Altamash, who are very, very familiar faces in the debate circuit of India. Well, let's start with Altamash. Both of them actually sent me enough credentials to make my throat go dry. So, well, let's start with Altamash. His speaking credentials include the winner, 4th on tabs at the IIT BHUPD 2020. He was the novice semi-finalist at IIT Bombay debate in 2017, novice finalist in GNLU debate 2017, so on and so forth. Some of his adjudicating credentials include the co-adjudicator at ADO 20. He was the invited adjudicator at the finals panel at Halla Bol PD. He was at the invited adjudicator at the finals panel of the Big Somaija debate in 2018. He was the invited adjudicator of the RGID debate in 2019, so on and so forth. Indrajeet Banerjee also has similar such credentials that are going to make my throat dry, but he just asked me to say that he is a debate enthusiast, which he truly is. After speaking with him for a few minutes, I could tell. But I think that's it for the introductions. We'll get straight to the content now. I hope you enjoy. Let us know what you think in the comments. Tell us what you think before we begin with our topic. Should the death penalty be allowed, and what you think of it after? What you thought of our speakers? Anything you'd like to add? And yeah, that's enough from me. Let's get right into it. Enjoy. All right, so welcome everyone. This is the first round of the Flow Is Yours, the tournament edition of it. We have 8 teams total competing. This is the first preliminary round. There are 4 teams here. We have 2 judges judging this. It includes Altamash Kabir and Indrajeet Banerjee, who are here. Thank you for your time. And 4 other teams competing to be the top 2 going to the finals. Now, the teams comprise of Pranit and Parikshit in one team, Ave and Shinjoy in another, Yash and Pranav in one, Shomojyoti and Richik in a team, and yeah, that's it for this round. So I think we'll not continue with any introduction further and move on to the first speaker, who is Pranit, who will be making his speech for 2 minutes at the start and 2 minutes at the end to give him a chance to refute points. Pranit, are you ready?
Yeah.
Pranit, you have the floor for the next 2 minutes.
Thank you. Taking someone's life is irreversible and irreparable, a very well-known facet of capital punishment. Now, the criminal justice system suffers from several flaws, and these have resulted in numerous lives being taken unfairly and wrongfully. Now, the opposition will definitely point out that these flaws underlie the entire criminal justice system, and removing the death penalty or abolishing it won't do anything to specifically solve these issues. However, I posit that it then becomes the burden of the opposition to point out how they will outlie and improve these flaws as a whole, so that the numerous wrongful executions that have occurred due to the miscarriage of the capital punishment will not occur again. So that cases like Johnny Garrett, Jess Tefero, Carlos De Luna will not have to stain our hands with blood any further. Now, please note that the three of many examples that I just presented were from the United States alone. Please understand that in other countries such as Indonesia and Malaysia, yeah. these issues are even more dangerous, and the unavailability of legal resources to members of poorer or less prominent groups or minorities in these areas will cause them to be disproportionately targeted, as has been done. Let's consider the case of Sita Zainab, a domestic worker in Indonesia, who, after horrifically cruel treatment by her employers, committed a murder in that household and was thus put on death row. Furthermore, please understand that in countries such as Indonesia and Malaysia and other less developed countries, offenses such as drug offenses will put people on death row, whereas in other regions they might have resulted in a slap on the wrist at most. Thus, we ask the opposition to present any credible evidence why this punishment, which allows no room for reform and which takes a life unnecessarily in many cases, should be justified, especially considering that it does not deter crime.
Pranit, wrap up. All right. That's the first part of his speech. We'll now be taking 3 questions from the participants and then move on to the judges if they have any. I think the first question we'll take from Yash and then move on to Parikshit and then to Richik. Yash, your question.
All right. So the proposition speaker clearly stated that he stated a few examples and has stated that because the death penalty was not carried out in a proper and just way in these scenarios, it should be abolished as a whole. But however, does the House not think that the death penalty exists in several countries other than Indonesia, Malaysia, and such examples? For example, in India itself, the Nirbhaya case took 8 years before the death penalty was actually given to the people who were accused 8 years ago, and therefore there is a lot of room for the people being proven innocent or their case being retried over the course of those 8 years. And therefore, in these countries, do you not think that the capital punishment system should be reformed and new laws should be put in place? And do you not think that abolishing it would be a measure too harsh and therefore ignoring the examples of good practice for the same measure?
Sir, I believe that the death penalty itself is a measure too harsh and that in most cases it is not even morally permissible. However, since it is legally provided for, I am arguing within that framework. Now, I did not only mention examples of Indonesia and Malaysia. The first 3 examples and many more that I could have named were from the United States itself, a country with a much cleaner record and a much better reputation for carrying out criminal justice effectively. Furthermore, I believe that there is no reason for the death penalty to persist since as of this stage in the debate the opposition has not provided for such. I believe that the irreversibility of these cases in wrongful executions is enough evidence for it to be abolished.
All right, thank you. And just before we move on to the next question from Parikshit, I'd just like to mention to the speakers to keep their questions a bit short and not provide too much of an explanation. Instead of making a speech, just ask their question instead.
Suryansh, a small clarification.
Yes.
Aren't Pranit and Parikshit of the same team?
Yes.
So are members of the same team allowed to question each other because it will lead to answering of questions from beforehand?
Well, seeing as they have opposing stances, we're just we're recognizing on the order of who raises their hands first. So
okay, cool.
Parikshit, your question.
Right, so Pranit, at the beginning of your speech, you said that the death penalty is something which is irreversible. Then what would be your stance on euthanasia, especially when people are relieved of their plight and of their pain, because euthanasia is something that is legally binding, legally permissible in many countries? What would be your response to euthanasia for that same matter?
Firstly, I doubt the relevance of a completely separate paradigm such as euthanasia in an argument involving the death penalty. And furthermore, if you really want a response, I believe that euthanasia in many cases is carried out with much more nuance than the death penalty is, where I and perhaps other members of the proposition will point out more severe and more notable flaws in the carrying out of the death penalty than in euthanasia.
All right. I think we'll take the next question, which is from Richik.
So, Pranit, you mentioned something about drug trafficking and how in certain countries, drug trafficking sometimes lands the perpetrator a death penalty, right? So, in such a situation, don't you believe that the seriousness of a particular crime is relative to the region in which it is placed, and therefore the punishment should vary accordingly?
No, I do not believe so. I believe that as far as a crime such as the one that I mentioned, which is drug trafficking goes, I do not believe that the region has anything to do with how morally acceptable it is to take the person's life as a repercussion against it. And I don't believe there's any reason to believe that the region in which it is placed would have anything to do with it.
Right. I don't think there are any follow-ups. So I think we'll move on to the judges if they have a question on this speech.
I do.
Yes.
So countries like South Korea already have a moratorium on the death penalty, and countries like India do not. In that case, tell me what the difference between the two is and why one of those routes is preferable to the other.
Oh, could you please repeat the first sentence of
Countries like South Korea already have a moratorium on the death penalty, and countries like India do not. Tell me what's the difference between the two, and why is your morality so uniformly applicable compared to whatever Op will argue?
My speech did not mention morality as such. It mentioned specific instances of the death penalty's wrongful miscarriage in countries such as the US and other regions. And thus, considering that I did not bring up morality as a main constructive argument in my case, I don't think that my speech is answerable to such a question.
All right. Thank you, Pranit. And I think now we'll
One more question, Suryansh.
Yes, Yash.
If anyone asks a question that is directly applicable to all of the propositions or all of the opposition stance, then can another speaker from the opposite prop answer the question?
If
Just in general, not for this scenario.
If the judges or the person asking the question is open to it being answered by anyone other than the person they direct the question towards, that can be allowed. Again, the person answering the question also has to allow it. So depending on what happens there, in that particular situation, will be progress.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. So with that, we will not be engaging in any further discourse on Pranit's speech. Thank you, Pranit. We'll now be moving forward into his teammate's speech, or the first opposition member speech, which is Parikshit Roy Chaudhary. Parikshit, are you ready?
Yep, ready.
Right. So you said that you wanted 2.5 minutes for the first part of your speech. So Parikshit, for the next 2.5 minutes, the floor is yours.
Right. So I would begin my speech by answering the concerns of the first proposition speaker, where they're talking about how do we mitigate wrongful conviction. Now, the fact is that there are a number of safeguards that are already available in many countries where the death penalty is actually legal, such as the petitions, appeals, or the proportionality reviews, the writs, the pleas, and the concept of the pardon that already exists. At the same time, since the motion does not restrict us to a certain country, on a general overview, a number of other safeguards can be developed in the course of time in order to prevent a wrongful conviction. The motion over here today offers us a complete abolition and not just a mere restriction on death penalties. And therefore, the opposition over here would also come up with the argument where we are talking about the democratization of the process. If a jury with comprising of a very representative a representative demographic of the society can again decide on whether the death penalty is legally justifiable or not and whether it should be carried out for a particular case, then that is even more democratic than it is not. And at the same time, this again addresses the issue of the proposition regarding wrongful conviction, because the number of people have to be convinced in order to ensure that such a penalty should be executed. At the same time, what are we looking at alternatives to the death penalty? We are looking at something in terms of a hard labor for life without parole and in solitary confinement. Now, if we compare the humaneness of humaneness of such a punishment in with respect to death penalty, then we again realize that the death penalty would be something which is much more humane, even for the convict, because something as severe as a hard labor for life in solitary confinement can be very difficult to execute, especially for the convict himself. At the same time, we must realize that, say, a murder might come with a punishment of a life imprisonment. Then what is the extra punishment that may be given if there are multiple murders of the same issue? Which brings me to my fourth constructive, which is, what about situations which are crimes against humanity, such as the Holocaust, such as bioterrorism, where a number of people are affected, and there is a very high chance that in case the convict does escape from imprisonment, then there is a very high chance that they would be repeating their crimes yet again. At that same time, again, we must realize that such chances of escapism, especially when we look at the Holocaust and such other crimes against humanity, which may be repeated by the individual, can be mitigated through the death penalty. With that, I end my speech.
Thank you, Parikshit. You'll be getting the rest of the time at the end. We'll be moving forward to 3 questions for now, which we'll first take a question from Pranav Bhandari and then move on to Ava.
Right. So, sir, you spoke about how there are different ways to address the loopholes in these systems, right? They could be reformed. But so, given that there are so many variables, such as the fact that these are not death penalty not restricted only to democracies, and secondly, in our very own country, where the penal code does not completely cover the purview of psychological disability, since there are so many variables, don't you think an alternative such as isolatory confinement would be better to the death penalty? Because even if 1 out of 10 cases is wrong, especially in case of a death penalty, that is definitely a grave mistake.
Right, sir. So, with regards to your question of the number of variables that exist, again, that is not an argument to tell us that we should absolutely abolish the death penalty, because there is always scope for improvement in the policies. So, if you look at the entire course of history, the safeguards that have existed have been kept improving, and at the same time, that is the core argument, that in case there are a number of variables which we cannot address during such situations, we can definitely restrict the purview of the death penalty, but that does not mean we completely remove the option. At the same time, when you're talking about the cases like in democracies where such safeguards can actually establish, the question of debating on whether or not the death penalty should be abolished does not even exist in a public forum in a dictatorship, because then it would be completely decided by the autocratic head over there. And therefore, when we are debating on such a motion in a public forum, we must realize that yes, it will be something where the person and where the opinion of the public will be of certain value. At the same time, coming to the third part of your question, when you were talking about whether or not the psychological imbalances of a person is considered, again, in your question itself, you propose that the solitary confinement would be better. However, especially in the cases of psychological imbalances, if you keep someone in hard labor without parole in solitary confinement for years on end, that could actually have a much more negative impact on the psychological well-being of that individual. And that is again another reason that in a way supports the argument of the opposition, because a immediate death will be something which is much more humane. But at the same time, as we've already I've reiterated in my speech, that the safeguards already exist. Even in the Nirbhaya case, when it takes so long, then there were options of taking up new lawyers who can defend your case better. So with these number of safeguards and an additional safeguard for judging the
Parikshit,
psychological imbalances of an
I think
individual,
we should
I think the
that
motion still
answer
fails.
now. Right.
Yeah.
Thank you. The next question was from Ava, and then I think we'll move on to.
Yeah, before I ask my question, could I just clarify something you said in your speech?
Yeah,
Sure.
Did you say that the death penalty is more humane as a punishment than hard labor for life or solitary confinement?
Yes.
Sir, on what basis do you believe that taking away someone's right to life, to live and to
Exactly.
is more humane than through hanging them or shooting them or giving them a lethal injection is more humane than keeping them in prison and allowing them to at least live?
Right. So again, I would draw on the example of one of the speeches that was given in the 1880s in front of the British monarch, when there was the same question that was brought up, and the reasons that were given were actually quite sound. When the reason was that when you do keep someone in hard labor for life in solitary confinement without parole, then what is the standard of living that individual actually gets? All that individual gets to do throughout his entire day is wake up and look forward to only a slice of bread for his food, get his water, and that's the entire life that we have. So when we're questioning whether or not something is humane or not, we concern ourselves with the simple question that even if that person does get to live, what are the factors that actually give you the standard of living where we could call that standard of living actually
Right.
humane and worth?
Parikshit, I think you should Parikshit, keep your for later. Just keep your answers a bit shorter. We still have a bit
Could I please follow up?
Surya's
one
question.
left. 1 second. We'll take that. I think we'll take that follow up. Or just keep it short.
Then why don't we keep the questions for the next 1.5 minutes that I also have?
Yeah, we'll have.
Ask me 3 right now. We'll just have 1 left for later.
No. We'll take 2 now and 2 later, right? Because he has
So we've already taken 2.
1.5 minutes later.
Right. So
Just one more short
Right
question.
now, right?
we can, ladies and gentlemen, what you should understand is that we'll also, all of you will also be getting time in your speech to refute points made by the other speakers. So you should note that you're also being marked by the judges on your rebuttals, which is why you should also consider the time you're going to be using in your speeches, as well as the questions you ask.
Okay, may I follow up on that?
One line.
Yeah.
So,
So,
okay,
why do
Viraj,
you
one
believe?
question before that. Will the follow up, do I need to respond to that? And is that being counted as the third question?
No,
It's simply a follow up to that same question. That's first, and secondly, whether you choose to respond to that or not is entirely up to you.
Yeah.
sir, why do you believe that the criminal justice system should have the right to decide what sort of life is quote unquote worth living for the convict? And why do you believe that the criminal justice system should decide that this sort of life is not worth living for them and that thus they should die? Don't you think that should be left to the person?
Right. So again, over here we're restricting ourselves to the generally accepted principles that already exist right now. That it is only the criminal justice system over here that is going to decide on that. However, when we look at the stance of side opposition, where the motion does state clearly that the death penalty should be abolished, we must realize that there could also be a factor where the convict himself can decide on whether or not that convict wants to take on a death penalty or face a life imprisonment with hard labor, no parole, and solitary confinement. So then again, that was the second point which I made, which was about the democratization of the system, where there's the choice that is available to both ends. Because
Parikshit, wrap it up.
because what we must realize is that what we are debating on is just the theory of whether or not the death penalty should actually be abolished, and not just about what is actually being happening in practice at this point. Because this is something which is more
All
theoretical and
right, that's it.
logical than the practice.
Okay, thank you, Parikshit. Okay, with that, we'll save the. Or no, before we move on to the next speech, we have to take a question from the judges if they have one. All right. So I think we'll move on to the next speaker now, which is
Can one question be allowed then?
we'll be taking questions at the next part of the speech.
At the end.
Each for every part of a speech or in every speech, the judges are allowed to ask a question, regardless of the circumstance. Um, so with that, we'll be moving on to the next speaker, which is in fact you, Shoma Jyoti. You have 4 minutes on the clock, and yeah, Shoma Jyoti, are you ready?
Yes.
Okay. So Shoma Jyoti, you have 4 minutes, and your time starts now.
A very good afternoon to one and all present. Gentlemen, most people say accusing the time is not excusing ourselves. But I tell you today, we live in a world where violence and vandalism is as it had never been before. In this procrastinating and horrifying experience, what matters is when the question, or when the morality of states is being questioned, the state should consider what is moral and what is immoral. Now, I remember reading a story called The Bed by Anton P. Chekhov, wherein a banker and lawyer are arguing that which is more effective. Is it capital punishment, that is death penalty, or is it lifelong imprisonment? And there it clearly states that capital punishment kills you at once, whereas lifelong imprisonment drags the life out of you in the course of many years. Which is more effective, the one which kills you at once, or the one which drags the life out of you in the course of so many years? Also, it is quite immoral for the states to induce capital punishment in a particular country and kill a person at once, or apply death penalty, because imprisonment allows that person to himself in the course of so many years. And also there are countries which utilize it in a better fashion. Like in China, there is a practice wherein people who are in prison, whenever there is some test of any new disease or blood samples or anything is required, they take it from the prisoners. The blood samples of the prisoners are taken for various tests. And so therefore that wouldn't have been possible if capital punishment or death penalty would be present there. Also, ladies and gentlemen, the application of death penalty is so arbitrary that it violates the 8 Amendments prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. The death penalty doesn't deter crime. It costs taxpayers more than life imprisonments. It doesn't deter criminals. There is no credible evidence that death penalty deters crime more effectively than a prison term. In fact, evidence reveals the opposite. Because since abolishing the death penalty in 1976, Canada's murder rate has steadily declined, and as of 2016, it has its lowest since 1996, according to the Amnesty International. Also, two-thirds of the world's countries, ladies and gentlemen, has done away with death penalty in either law or in practice, because death penalty has no deterrent effect. Last year, according to the Amnesty International, death sentences were imposed in 63 countries, but only 21 countries actually carried out in executions. Also, in the past 12 years, if we look at our own country, in India, there have been only 2 hangings, 2 executions in the past 12 years. And the majority of countries on death row can expect their sentences to be commuted to life. India has shied away also from executing people for many years now. Lastly, gentlemen, I would like to say that when Gutenberg invented the printing press, he was labeled as a heretic, wanting to change the national order of things. When John Logie Baird invented the television, he was labeled as someone wanting to dull the mind and stifle the intellect. Later in the 90s, when Nintendo and Sega were revolutionizing the gaming industry, their names in households throughout the world were taken in the same breath as that of an antichrist. So isn't it quite strange for this human mind to fear change, this propensity to fear innovation? And therefore, ladies and gentlemen, a practice which has existed in many countries for years may seem to be absolutely completely fine and absolutely effective, but the human needs to think of change, and the death penalty needs to be abolished completely. As two-thirds of the countries have already done away with it, the remaining countries should also be done away with the death penalty. And change is a wonderful thing if you embrace it, and it's for the betterment of the society, because it allows the person undergoing lifelong imprisonment with not only solitary confinement, which we all can understand
Wrap
now
up.
as we are locked down, and we can understand how hard or painful solitary confinement is. It drags the life out of you in the course of so
I want
many
you to
years,
wrap up.
but it also gives a chance to that person to improve and do something productive in life, as many important productive
All
cases
right.
we see in be it
All right.
China or in
So
other
Majidi,
prisons of
that's it.
other countries being utilized in a better fashion. Thank you. Thank you.
All right. All
Yeah.
right. Thank you. Just another note to the speakers. As soon as I mention wrap up, that should be your
Yes.
cue to cap the point
Wrap up.
you're making. So I think we'll move on to questions from the speakers now. We'll take a question from first. We'll take a question from Srinjoy. Then we'll take a question from Yash, followed by Parikshit. Srinjoy, your question.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Right.
Yes. Yes.
So in your argument, you stated that since the penalty death rate of India has been reduced, that is, India has been granting less of death penalties, that is evidence that it should be abolished. But do you not believe that the fact that only 2 death penalties have been granted in India in recent years actually indicates that the death penalty is being more
Exactly.
reasonably used, and therefore there is no grounds for us to actually abolish it due to its reasonable usage?
Right.
All right. So, sir, first of all, I never mentioned that in India it has already reduced. I mean, the intention has already brought into some good effect. All I said, in the past 12 years, there have been only 2 executions in India, which is a fact. And I mentioned the examples of countries like Canada, and according to the Amnesty International, 63 out of 63 countries, only in 21 countries executions have actually been carried out, and countries are doing away with it. And that has shown consecutive good results in the next few years. Like in Canada, since 1996, the crime rate has actually reduced after they have done away with the death penalty, and it's been steadily at the lowest as in 2016. That's the example I brought up.
May I get a follow-up?
And therefore, two-thirds of the world's countries have done away with death penalty. Yes. All right.
Right.
Moderator decides.
Right. I think the answer to that's pretty clear, but if the judges would like to see a follow-up, I don't see why not.
think let's restrict the follow-ups for now, because I mean we are getting confused as to where to mark on, because we would like to mark you on
Right.
refutation.
Right.
So I think your follow-up should be your refutation, because we have a column called refutations. I would like to mark you there. Like your follow-up
Right. So Shinjoy, if your follow-up is to refute the point made by Shomajyoti, you can continue, or otherwise we'll move on to the next one.
Fine, I'll bring it up in my speech. Fair enough.
All right.
Yeah.
So I think we recognized Yash next. Yash, your question.
All right. So what I would like to ask you is that a lot of your arguments are fundamentally collapsing into themselves, and how does that further the motion? For example, your one of your arguments was from China taking blood samples. You must realize that when we talk about the death penalty, we talk about killing some people and not all prisoners. So prisoners still exist to take to take blood samples from. For example, China heavily enforces the death penalty, and even then they're the leaders in taking blood samples from criminals, and therefore these two are not mutually exclusive. Secondly, half of your speech was equating public executions and death penalties. However, these are two completely different forms of enforcing the capital punishment, and therefore they cannot be equated. And thirdly, most of what your speech stated was reforming the system in which capital punishment is implemented and death penalties are implemented, and not the concept in itself. And therefore, how do you think that any of the points you made were proposing the abolition of the death penalty as a whole and not its selective implementation?
So first of all, since you asked three questions in one, I will choose to answer any one, which is the first one. And I'll clearly mention, for first of all, when you ask me about how I am giving the example of China and thus backing my argument, what I wanted to say is, when you apply death penalty or capital punishment on a particular person, you take away the life from that person. That person's life, that person isn't anymore alive, and hence cannot be productive to the world, right? Secondly, on the other hand, when that same person is given lifelong imprisonment, which is any day more effective because solitary confinement drags the life out of you in the course of so many years. But at the same time, for those many years, for those number of years in which he's alive in prison, he contributes to the world in some way or the other. Just like I mentioned the example of China, where blood samples are taken. Thus, he is giving his body in a way for medical sciences, for testing. Thus, he's productive to the world in some way or the another in the course of the number of years he's alive. That's all I wanted to say.
Right. All right. Thank you.
So I just wanted to say something, Suryansh. I'd like to clarify something with the moderator.
Yes.
Yeah, so in the previous editions of this format that we've seen, when a question was recognized as one question, it was, even if it was a question with multiple facets and one question statement, it was still recognized as one question and the recording may be checked for the same. So therefore, was that not one question and not three questions?
I mean, it was all these multifaceted questions were asked. If we're talking about that procedure, it was asked in the format of three questions, but the speaker only has an obligation to answer one of them. But if
also the last two were so in such a fast
I request you not to interrupt yet,
Yes.
So along with that, I'd also like to mention that the speaker, if he wants to answer all three of them, he can. But he only has an obligation to answer the first part. Right. So with that being said, Shomajyoti, you had a
And
clarification.
maybe another question, Suryansh.
Yeah, we have three questions from the participants. So yeah, your question, Richard.
Yeah. So
One second, I was recognized for a question.
Oh right, Parikshit. Yes, sorry.
Yeah. Right. Okay, Shomajyoti, in your speech, you again, this refers to your example of China, where you said that one of that prisoners are subjected to viral tests for testing new medication. Then how do you propose that such testing would be an equal punishment for equal people? Because say a person is sentenced to such a punishment and another person as well, and you've got one, and both of them have only murdered one individual of the same status, then how do you propose that the effects of the viral test would be equal to both individuals, especially because viruses affect people differently?
Okay, so first of all, sir, that medical testing can no way be a punishment. A person who has committed probably a non-cognizable offense, or a lesser or a criminal offense of let's say lesser amplitude will not be given lifelong imprisonment. He'll be imprisoned for a few years. On the other hand, a person who has probably committed grave criminal offense like a murder or rape will be given lifelong the number of years for which the person is being imprisoned differentiates the kind or the course of punishment between the two persons and not the test, basically.
All right. So I think we'll move on to the judges' question
Yeah.
from now.
Yeah, I'll. So the thing is that it's more than a. Am I audible to everyone?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
So I think more than a question, it's a clarification for me to understand your speech better. You start by saying that lifelong imprisonment is like in a way it's murkier than capital punishment. It's a worse sort of punishment, and then you go on to say that prisoners are sort of lab rats. So I want to know the synergy between those two arguments where you say that they should be kept alive, but then you say that they should be kept alive in a humane fashion. So what is the linkage between those two?
Sir, I mentioned that capital punishment kills you at once, whereas lifelong imprisonment drags the life out of you in the course of many years. These are the lines from a story, The Bed by Anton P. Chekhov. So what I wanted to say is, which is more effective, capital punishment or death penalty or lifelong imprisonment? Because solitary confinement is any day, according to me, the most effective and the most suffering kind of punishment that a person can ever get. That's all I wanted to say. And all I wanted to say is, when they're kept alive, what can be done by the governments of several countries is, like I mentioned the example of China, where their blood samples or so, if organ donation or anything needed, that is used for medical sciences.
Shomajyoti, I think you got it there. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah,
Suryansh, aren't there supposed to be 4 questions from the participants in general?
No. There's 3 questions from the participants plus 1 which is of the judges.
Right.
But you can always have a chance to make a rhetoric in your speech.
Yeah.
So and you will get that chance now because you are the next speaker. You have 4 minutes on the clock. Are you ready? Yeah. All right. So your 4 minutes is now. The floor is yours.
So, very good afternoon to one and all present here. Now, everyone, let us focus on the crux of the death penalty in general, right? It is a means provided to law so that justice can be served and killers are denied the opportunity to perpetrate further murderous acts against innocent people, right? But what we need to consider in such a situation is that what people often fail to visualize is the situation within a prison. Right now, already the proposition brought up instances in the United States and prisoners in the United States. Right now, let us take the example of Whitey Bulger, who was killed by fellow inmates while incarcerated or while in prison. Now, this clearly shows that the people who commit such murderous acts are in fact not in a position to survive or thrive in a society like ours, and do not have the correct mindset to live in a society like ours, and often end up committing crimes against other inmates and or prison guards. Now, when we talk about crime rates falling due to abolition of the death penalty, right? Something that the proposition ignored was that in Canada, after the death penalty was in fact abolished, there was a certain growth in the economic rates and in employment, which was in no way in link with the abolition of death penalty, which is in fact a better thought as to why the crime rates in a particular country can decrease. Now, as people sitting here comfortably in our houses, it is easy for us to preach the idea of humanism, right? But let's not forget the core mistake while judging certain crimes is that the lack of insensitivity. Now, if we try to put ourselves in the shoes of these victims, right? If we try to visualize that we have lost someone we love or lost an important person in our lives who due to a heinous crime, we more often than not we'll see that we want the sort of punishment that natural justice can deliver more than the rule of law, because we see that capital punishment is in fact a form of serving natural justice, which is in fact often misplaced by the rule of law. It is actually capital punishment which is a better form of serving this sort of justice to the people who have been victimized. Now, the proposition brought up certain cases of miscarriage, right? However, let me bring into notice that there is extensive scrutiny and all perpetrators have a right to plea against the death penalty. And since 1995, only 5 instances of death penalty have occurred in India. Let us take the example of the United States again. When the United States Constitution first approved of this death penalty in the 18th and 19th amendments, they actually included the process of appealing against the death penalty. Even in 2002, the Supreme Court of India actually aroused actually actually proposed a curary petition in addition to the review petition, so that the perpetrators who think they deserve better than the death penalty can in fact plea against the death penalty. And there's also the precedent's vote, which is brought in control with regards to death penalty. Now, when we talk about taking innocent lives with regards to death penalty, let us not forget that the taking of innocent lives by these murderers is what has led to them being in this position in the first place, right? And standing in this position, it is up to natural justice to decide whether these people who have in fact snatched away the gift of life from several others should be given this gift in itself. And with that, I would like to end my speech, but not my stance.
All right. With that, he's wrapped up with that. Thank you, Richik. We'll now be moving forward to questions. We'll first take a question from Pranav. We'll then move on to Pranit and then to Ave.
Thank you for your speech, sir. So in your speech, you used an isolated example of an inmate who killed other inmates, right? And then you use it to justify death penalty. And you also spoke about how when we lose a person, an innocent person, right, then natural justice must be brought to this inmate. So when you consider isolatory confinement, this is first of all going to secure the person in a prison, and secondly also provide a prolonged punishment, provide more justice to this person for his heinous crimes. So how is it, do you consider isolation, death penalty to be a better alternative than isolation, sir?
Right. Thank you for your question, sir. Now, you connected two of my points without the linking factor in between, which was, as I mentioned, sensitivity, right? When we talk about crimes committed against innocent people, now you spoke of how this in particular inmate was killed by other inmates and solitary confinement, right? But keep in mind here that so for example, if we lose a loved one to a particular murder, right? Now, it is unfair, as is portrayed by capital punishment, that it is unfair for this person to have this chance of in fact fighting this case and keeping himself and keeping his life. And now also bringing in mind here that when we speak about solitary confinement, right, it does not necessarily seclude this particular inmate from everything. I also mentioned the danger that these inmates and their mental condition poses to prison guards and other inmates, given that even if they are inmates in solitary confinement, that in fact is a more inhumane form of treating a person rather than capital punishment, which in fact serves justice quicker as compared to any other means, given the seriousness of the crime.
Right. Thank you, Pranav. We'll take the next question now, which is from Pranith, and then move on to Ave. Pranith, your question.
So again, with one of the first examples mentioned in your speech as to how an inmate was killed by other inmates in a prison, and how this proved that those inmates weren't fit or didn't have the right mindset to exist in society. Now, consider the fact that this argument rests on the fact that, given the fact that those inmates turned down their opportunity to reform, they thus no longer have the right to exist in a society. So don't you think that all prisoners, including those put on death row, should have the opportunity to reform to prove that they are in fact fit for existing in society?
Sir, so thank you for your question, sir. Now, sir, let me just address the fact that the idea that your question brings is rather an idea based on idealism and not realism, right? It is as you can see that even when we talk about perpetrators have the right to plead against a particular guilty capital punishment appeal, right? Even they have the right to appeal against it. But however, once the capital punishment is granted, it is seen that, and by this example, it proves that these people, there is less hope of reform, as you can already see. And and being real with the situation, it leaves no question that these people are in fact these people are in fact are in fact these people are in fact supposed to get the death penalty as compared to, you know, someone who has successfully conveyed a plea.
All right, that's it. Thank you, Rajik. Thank you, Pranit.
Could
I
I
think
clarify something he said before I ask my question?
sure.
Sir, did you say that the death penalty gives comfort or helps the families of the victim?
That's
Was
not specifically what I said, sir. What I said was, if you envision yourselves as the victim, right? And it is completely relative as to what brings a particular person closure and what doesn't. All right. Now, when we talk about this, I suggested that death penalty is in fact the best way of serving natural justice, which does not prolong the period of justice taken to serve and provide closure to the family members of the victims.
okay. So, sir, given the fact that in cases of the death penalty, due to the continuous appeals and the court cases and the continuous system which continues to go on before the death penalty is given, don't you believe that it actually prolongs the period it actually prolongs the period of time required before justice is served? And don't you
Right.
believe
That
is the concept of justice rather than giving
wrap it up. Yeah. Thank you. Just before you answer that question, Rishik, to everyone here, just keep your questions a bit short. It's easier for the speaker to understand, and it's easy, and you'll get your answer back quicker. Yes, Rishik, your response.
Yeah. So thank you for your question, sir. Now, sir, the concept of defending a particular appeal only arises after a particular set of scrutiny processes, right? Now, if this particular review application is not granted in the first place, then there is no such concept of counter appeal or countering the death penalty in general. All right. So, sir, compared to lifelong imprisonment, which again, the prisoners may, due to certain situations in the modern day society, the prisoners may find themselves out of prison sooner than later, in fact, and find themselves on parole in certain occasions. Compared to that, the death penalty is a much shorter form of, a granted death penalty is a much shorter form of serving natural justice to the people.
Right. So I think thank you, Richard. Thank you, Ave. I think we'll take a question from the judges if they have one.
I have one.
Altamash,
One
are you
second.
taking? Altamash, are you taking?
Yeah, can I?
Please.
Thanks. Yeah. So you argue solitary confinement and compare it to death penalty. Tell me what is the purpose under which you want both of them to coexist? Because notice you're not arguing that solitary confinement is being being replaced by death penalty. You're arguing both in the same world. So either you want to replace all of the instances of solitary confinement with death penalty, or you're arguing them to coexist. They're not mutually exclusive. Tell me how this model works.
Okay. Sir, firstly, I think there might have been a misunderstanding here, but I did not argue for solitary confinement, right? What I said was, in place of solitary confinement, death penalty itself provides a much shorter form of serving natural justice to the people. Solitary confinement would, in fact, be a longer process and would not allow the serving of justice. Number two, solitary confinement in itself poses the threat to prison guards and other inmates along of perpetrating murderous acts, or being on the victim side of the inmate of a particular criminal, right? So I argued against the concept of solitary confinement as opposed to death penalty.
Right. Indrajeet, did you want to ask another question as well, or can we move on?
Suryansh, can I just understand if the clarification is clear? Like, should I clarify again or something?
No, I don't think. No, it's fine. We will mark you on what you've said.
Right. They've heard it. I think we won't engage in any further discourse into the speech, and we'll move on. Yes, Pranit, you had a clarification.
Can I ask for a clarification on the use of a word within Richik's speech, a specific word?
Sure, Richard.
Richik, did I heard you mention the term national justice. Did you, along with that, also mention natural justice?
It
As
was
in-
just natural justice. There was no concept of national justice.
Okay, so it was only natural justice.
Yeah, natural
Alright.
justice.
All right,
Thank
that's it. Thank you. So we'll move on to the next speech after Richik, which is from starting with the next team. We're starting with Pranav Bhandari speaking for the proposition.
Do I have the floor? Right.
Uh,
Good
yes.
afternoon, all present here. Now, the point of imprisonment of convicting someone is reform. But since majority of side opposition's argument is targeted towards murderers, serial killers, and committers of grave crimes, I shall address those. These people, the point for these people to convict them is to make them repent. Right. Now, the problem is they should be put in isolation for life because capital punishment simply does not provide the retention required in this case. And to compare it with the death penalty, right? To compare isolation with the death penalty, the death penalty is not deterrent enough. It is a simple fact that this regime is ineffective because murderers and serial killers are aware of the punishment that they incur if they commit these heinous crimes. They still go on to commit these, and it is time to it is basically ineffective, and the use of capital punishment is non-existent. Now, the humaneness, right? One major loophole I would like to address in the opposition's argument. They argue that isolation is not humane enough. Isolation is not humane enough. A person cannot be kept in isolation the entire life. This has been a major argument of side opposition. I would like to ask this house the question: are committers of crimes such as those rapists in the Nirbhaya case, do they deserve humaneness? Whether or not capital punishment is humane enough, or less or more humane than isolation, is beyond my purview. My question is, should humaneness even be should it even be a factor when you're deciding the punishment to be put on the committers of these heinous crimes? Now, I would also like to address the anomaly cases in several instances in several countries. Let us take our own penal code for example. There are numerous cases where people of unsound mind do not fall under the purview of Section 84 of the Indian Penal Code, and this is because an abnormality of mind and partial delusion or impulse and compulsive psychopathic behavior do not fall under the purview of this particular part of the Indian Penal Code. You have to prove complete lunacy at the particular time of committing this crime, and this can, in some instances, lead to a particular loophole, and there might be someone who did not deserve capital punishment who has received it. When there is even 1 out of 10 people dying when they did not deserve so, what is natural justice going to do for them? You are putting this is a very vicious cycle which needs to be put an end, and this is why we need solitary confinement. Also, I would like to address those cases that the opposition is bringing up where they say that people who have been released from prison, they are a harm to society because very simply they are a harm to society. Now, I would like for the house to stick with me on this one. Those cases where people have been released from prison or have not been given capital punishment and they have created problems, they cannot come under consideration because currently the capital punishment exists and these people were not given the capital punishment in the first place. These people are not under the consideration of capital punishment in the first place, and they are outside the purview of this entire penalty. So that is not under discussion. We are here to discuss those who are being given this punishment and whether or not this punishment is particularly required. Now, I would like to address what the first speaker of side opposition said, where he mentioned that people who are psychologically challenged and are put in isolation, this simply worsens the condition for them. Sir, I would like you to understand that when somebody is psychologically challenged and they are diagnosed with psychological disability, those kind of people are not in all instances put into isolation. That is where the concept of reform comes into place. There are too many aspects that go against the point of capital punishment to have this still stand, and this is why it definitely needs to be abolished. Also, to address the speaker before me, one isolated case cannot justify the death penalty, and one particular case like he brought up, it is simply not value enough to keep the death penalty in place, and natural justice will be provided when these people who commit these crimes are given the required amount of punishment, and this is where I'd like to rest my case, but not my stance.
All right, thank you. With 5 seconds left in your speech, we will now move on to questions.
Suryansh,
Yes,
before you
yes.
move on, can I make a small comment?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so like I'm not deducting any marks for it. Okay, but just so that moving on here, we know this. So natural justice. Okay, it's a very particular concept in law, and the concept of natural justice states that both sides to any matter must be heard. That the person hearing you should not have any kind of like that person should not have any bias or any perception of bias, and whatever decision is given by that person who hears you or that body that hears you gives you reasons for his judgment, right? So natural justice, like what you guys are projecting, natural justice is not. It's not what natural justice is in strictly legal terms. So I understand you're trying to say that, hey, that's natural. You've killed someone, you must naturally die. But I just think that moving on here forth, just be careful about the usage of the term natural justice in asking questions in making the speech, because
Right.
that is what natural justice means.
Ah.
Anyway, I'm not deducting any marks. This is just for the benefit.
May I also make a clarification?
Yeah, please.
Can this clarification be directed to one of the judges?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So basically, when the national justice thing, right? Like you spoke about how each side is given an equal representation and no grudges hold, etc. But like when we talk about capital punishment, right?
Richik, I'm not going to engage on anything regarding the debate or your arguments. All I'm trying to say is that this term, I think thrice, I just noted it down, it's been misused. So what you said, as I said, I have not deducted, I see where you're coming from. I'm not deducting any marks. This is not to penalize any one of you. This is just to say that so that henceforth, you don't have to clarify your speech. I get where you're coming from. I just don't want you guys to sort of falter on that.
Understood.
Yeah, sure.
All right. Thank you for that clarification, Indrajeet. I think we'll now take questions on Pranav's speech. We'll take 3 questions. The first question will be taken from Richik. We'll then move on to Parikshit. Oh no, sorry. We'll move on to Shinjoy and then Parikshit.
So may I continue with my question, Suryansh?
Yeah, continue.
So thank you for your speech, sir. Now, sir, you mentioned the Nirbhaya case, right, in your speech. You had a particular instance where you mentioned the Nirbhaya case. Now, sir, if we closely look at the Nirbhaya case, sir, we see that one of the perpetrators in the Nirbhaya case was not, in fact, was not given the death penalty as such. He was, in fact, imprisoned because of a certain fallacy in the prison system itself, right? And this person who was the perpetrator of such a heinous crime is now free. Sir, do you think that serves justice in such a case where the death penalty was not awarded?
Your question, sir. So you said because of a fallacy in the justice system.
No, sir, because of a technicality in the prison system, sir. A technicality in the prison system.
So, right. So to address your question, I do not understand how this falls under the purview of death penalty. So even if it was considering isolation, we are here to discuss death penalty versus isolation. Even if the punishment being incurred was isolation, the person would still walk free. It is because of a fallacy in the prison system, right? This has nothing to do with death penalty.
No, sir.
Sir, I understand your question. Let me rephrase my answer. Sir, I understand your question. You are trying to say that this person walked free, and how is this justice? My point to you is, even if the punishment being incurred was isolation, if all the people were being given solitary confinement for their entire life, this person would still walk free because of the fallacy in the prison system. We are talking about death penalty versus no death penalty, and your question in that case does not stand.
All right, that's his answer, Richik. I think we'll move on to the next question. I believe we recognized Srinjoy to ask the next question.
No, that was me.
All right. So apologies. Parikshit, your question.
Right. So in your speech, you started your speech by defending isolation, by saying that the criminals do not deserve the humaneness. And then you went on to say that the same criminals, if they do have some psychological imbalances, then they do deserve the humaneness. Are you not contradicting your own statements?
So having a psychological disability is recognized by almost every single government in the world. The point is that this person is of unsound mind. I do not see how I am contradicting myself, because being given exceptions in the case of psychological disability is a very real world concept. This is a very real world concept, and it is in place everywhere today.
Right, that's it. Thank you, Pranav. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Parikshit. We'll take the next question. I believe that was from Shinjoy.
Right.
Yes.
Sir, so in your speech, you mentioned that you believe that humanness should not be a factor while judging the punishment given for these unnatural crimes, right? But at the same time, you said that the objective of the criminal justice system is to make the prisoners repent for life, and that is only possible in life imprisonment and solitary imprisonment. But so, considering that humaneness should not be a factor, does that not mean that the appropriate proportionate justice should be meted out to them as in accordance with their crimes, and it is justice to the victims that should be looked at, and not whether we are giving the perpetrator a
Just a
chance to repent?
question, Shinjo,
Thank
not
you.
an
No,
explanation.
I understand his question. So let me propose this to you. Whether or not the person is being if the person is given capital punishment, what kind of justice is this to the victim? The victim has already suffered the crime. We are now talking about incurring punishment on the criminal. There is no difference to the victim whether or not the person dies. But the difference is that the person is made to repent for life. As for addressing the humaneness aspect, I was addressing speeches of two previous opposition side speakers who had said that lifelong imprisonment and isolation is not humane enough, and that is why they should be given the death penalty. While that is a wild concept in my head itself, it is not for me to judge the subjectiveness of humaneness. My question is, should that even be a factor in the first place? And these people.
Right.
Thank
That's
you.
it. Yeah,
Thank
I think the judges have understood what you're trying to say, and yeah. Uh, do the judges have a question, or should we take one more from the participants?
Altamash, do you want to take this? Do you
I
have
would
a
have a
question?
question. If
You
you
have a
have
question?
one, you can ask.
No. Do you have one, Altamash? You don't, right?
No.
Okay, cool.
Right. So in
So
that,
yeah, I'll ask a question.
okay.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Pranav, I think before I begin, I think someone else also asked you this, that you said that there should be lifelong repentance. So according to you, I just wanted your opinion on this.
Right.
What do you think should be the balance for a government between serving out revenge
Right.
and creating deterrence? Because
Creating deterrence.
what do you think, where do you think is the balance between serving out revenge or closure, whereas you say that that person should be made to repent throughout his lifetime, and creating deterrence so that newer people do not commit that crime?
Right.
According to you, what do you think?
Yeah. So definite repentance is definitely an important aspect once they have committed the crime, but the priority definitely lies on the deterrence factor. When you talk about, if I may continue with my answer, when you talk about isolation, the person, it is psychologically scarring in very direct terms, and this is definitely more of a deterrent than the current system, because you lose your life in a matter of seconds. While that is also scarring, you lose your life in a matter of seconds, and the repentance is much more in terms of isolation, and that amounts to a larger deterrent. But while the deterrent is still obviously a priority.
Right. I think that answers the question. All right. So I think we'll now move on to the next speaker for this debate, which is Pranav's teammate, Yash. Yash, can you hear us?
Yeah.
Right. You have 4 minutes on the clock, and yeah, your time starts now.
All right, I'm going to be speaking for the opposition of the motion. And firstly, I'd like to address a question posed by one of the judges, but not addressed by any of the speakers before me, a moratorium. Now, you must realize that when you address something as grave as the death penalty, there are several ways to look at it legally. You can either keep it in normal practice, establish a moratorium, or abolish it. While a moratorium and an abolition are very similar, an abolition is an absolute measure where once and for all, you're not allowing anyone to issue a death penalty at all. However, a moratorium is a temporary stop on the process until and unless a very high authority finds the situation such that it is extremely exceptional and extremely grave, and therefore the stop must be lifted, and therefore a death penalty can still be placed. In comparison between an abolition and a moratorium is obviously very favorable. However, between normal practice and a moratorium, it is dependent case to case. For example, in situations like California, Canada, or South Korea, a moratorium might be the best measure, while abolition might not be. However, and maybe even in a country like India. However, in states like Michigan in the United States, where the death penalty has to be imposed often because of extremely high crime rates, a moratorium is not justified. And one of the speakers of the proposition also stated that we're taking examples where the death penalty already exists but was not imposed. However, I'd like to take an example of a US state where the death penalty has been completely abolished and has been so for multiple centuries. For example, Michigan. Michigan does not have the death penalty. I'd like to take two examples from this state that show how the world cannot function without a death penalty, and why abolition of the death penalty is an extremely detrimental measure. First of all, Albert Frick. In 1979, he was imprisoned for stabbing his wife 14 times in front of his daughter. He was imprisoned, and then in 2004, based on a technicality, he was released once again. And when he was released, 6 years later in 2010, he sexually assaulted and killed another woman. Again, he was imprisoned, and in 2018, he was released once again, based on another technicality. And the official prison statement said that he was too old for prison, and I quote this from a news article, from an ABC News article. In 2019, once again, he was convicted for stabbing, stalking, and then killing a homeless woman and stabbing her 11 times in front of her twin daughters. Now, I see a pattern here. This man was mentally unstable, and logically, in any other state in the United States where the death penalty is present, would have been given the death penalty. But since the death penalty was not present, him not being given the death penalty, saving that one guilty life, cost us the life of two innocents. Another example, Catherine Wood in 1980 murdered 5 women in an old age nursing home. And the morality of this is already questionable. She was imprisoned and then again released. And in this case, later after she was released, the lead investigator, when she was convicted, released a statement saying that no one should be living in her block because she's still a very important danger to society, and therefore everybody should stay away from her. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I ask you, if we are releasing someone who is recognized as a danger to society by the lead investigator who imprisoned her in the first place, then why should she be at all released to society? Should she be not given the death penalty as she would have been given in any other scenario? Thirdly, Canada's crime rates were brought up. Now, we must realize that Canada's crime rates were already rapidly dropping, and the death penalty did not accelerate this drop in the crime rates. It, in fact, did not even affect them. The crime rates were dropping as they were. The death penalty was an indifferent measure. The abolition of the death penalty was an indifferent measure carried out in the middle. And lastly, I quote a proposition speaker, humaneness should not be considered when dealing with criminals such as those of the Nirbhaya case. Now I bring to you an example, the September 11th attacks. Some would say that the September 11th attacks were more inhumane than the Nirbhaya case, and in such cases, the United States is rumored to adopt a policy known as Guantanamo Bay. Now, to that speaker, I ask, do you think that Guantanamo Bay is an apt measure? And if you say that we should not account for humaneness at all in some cases, then why not just use Guantanamo Bay for all such crimes? Thank you.
All right, thank you, Yash. With that, I think we'll move on to questions on his speech. We'll be taking.
I just have a clarification regarding the speech, not a question.
Sure. Go ahead.
The speaker mentioned 2 names, 2 states of the United States at front, where one of them imposed death penalty on a regular basis and the other had abolished it. Now, what were the 2 states?
Michigan had abolished it. California had the most death row inmates and abolished it more recently. However, my examples were from when the death penalty still existed.
Oh, okay.
Right. So with that, we'll be taking questions. We'll take the first question from Pranit, followed by Pranav, followed by Ave. Sorry, seeing as Shomajyoti hasn't asked a question yet, we'll take a question from Shomajyoti and not Ave.
May I begin?
Yeah.
So you mentioned the concept of a moratorium, which allows a legal provision to be suspended while a legal challenge is carried out or reformation. Now, if considering that there are harms to keeping the death penalty in place, don't you believe that the 2 examples you mentioned, don't you believe that by removing those specific technicalities which led to those cases would be a better way of implementing legal reform than avoiding the abolishment of the death penalty?
Thank you, Pranit. I believe that question was very required since I couldn't address this in my speech. Firstly, stating that these technicalities are present in the prison system for good. However, their use for bad is extremely easy, and abolishing them would cause the legal system to collapse as a whole. Because certain cases, like for example, exemptions where people are mentally unstable or not of sound mind, are such examples. However, you cannot remove them. However, misusing them is very easy, and therefore, in crimes such as this, where the death penalty could be implemented, they should be implemented because the room for error is huge, and therefore we should not put them into a situation where the room for error could even arise.
Right,
and therefore
right.
The death penalty would be more sustainable.
That's it. Thank you. I think the judges have understood what both speakers were trying to say there. And now we'll move on to the next question, which is from Pranav. Pranav, your question.
Right. Sorry, Shomilati, your mic is never mind. So so first of all, about this Guantanamo Bay is an unconstitutional measure, and it is definitely not what the proposition is proposing. It was isolatory confinement. Now, when you talk in regards to this, when you talk about the cases where death penalty was not in place, and then these people were released into society, and they should have been given death penalty, but they went on to kill people outside, right? The point here being is not to impose death penalty, but this person should have been given solitary confinement. So why do you think that death penalty is the one that should have stayed and not solitary confinement?
So the problem is that once somebody is imprisoned, an appeal to the court's ruling can even then be raised as long as the person is still alive. And therefore, even if someone is in solitary confinement, his lawyer can 10 years later come up and say that can find a technicality in the law which allows him to be released, which was present in both cases of Albert Fick and Catherine Wood that I brought up in my speech. And therefore, even in solitary confinement, this room for error still exists. However, if the person is given apt time to logically prove themselves innocent and then given the death row, then the room for error does not exist anymore. And once they are dead, the case is then legally closed.
Right. I think that answers your question, Pranav. So we'll now move on to the next question, which is from Shomajyoti. Shomajyoti, your question.
All right, sir. So in your speech, you clearly mentioned about certain regions or countries in which a death penalty moratorium can prove to be more effective, and then you suddenly mentioned the name of Canada, where is it all? The death penalty has already been abolished in Canada since 1976, and this is not me saying, this is an Amnesty International report. And you said the death penalty did not stop the crime rates. The crime rates were already reduced, but it has been seen that after 1976, as of 2016, since 1996, the crime rates have been lower and lower, and in 2012 16 it was the lowest, and that was after the abolition of death penalty. So how do you justify your statement to be without any source or a particular fact to be correct as compared to an Amnesty International report?
Sure, I've not stated disputable facts. I've stated facts that are known to everyone and in the news and in government reports. Secondly, so you stated the moratorium with respect to Canada and how the death penalty has already been abolished there. What I stated was that since Canada is in such a scenario where the death penalty could have been abolished, a moratorium would have been more apt, since in exceptional cases that could arise anywhere, irrespective of the circumstances, a moratorium would have been more legally and logically apt than an abolition. And secondly, sir, Amnesty International itself has an agenda, and their entire charter is such that they are meant to promote certain beliefs, and therefore they manipulate information in such a way as to propose a certain point. And while the information is not wrong, what you must realize is that California's crime rates have had a linear decrease, and almost linear decrease. If you draw a line of best fit on the data, then the line will be a straight line pointing downwards. And in such a case, any recent year could be stated as the year where the crime rates have been lowest. If you measure up to 2016, 2016 will be the lowest. If you measure up to 2019, 2019 would have been the lowest. And
right. Give
me one last sentence. And if you abolish the death penalty in 1996 and you drew a line up till there, then even in 1996, the crime rate would have been the lowest.
Right. I think that answers the question. I think we'll, do the judges...
So, Suryansh, just a small clarification. Yeah.
Yes.
Just a small clarification. Can the speaker just mention the source where he mentioned ABC News article and mention certain points? Can the speaker just mention that source, or what is that ABC News article? Since the speaker is questioning the legitimacy of already existing official reports like Amnesty International report, I would like to know the source of it.
I've never questioned anything you stated. None of the facts you stated. This is the conclusions you have drawn from those facts. I draw separate conclusions from the same facts. I have never questioned the legitimacy of your facts. My facts come from ABC 7 news articles on Catherine Wood. You can look it up, or Albert Fick murder case. If you look up these words on the internet, you'll find many American news outlets reporting on the same since it was big in news media.
Right. I think we'll no longer engage in this line of questioning any further. We'll unless the judges have a question. Otherwise, I think we should move on from here.
Yeah, I don't have a question. Altamash, if you do.
I don't either.
Right. Okay. So I think we'll move on to the next speaker, which is Aved speaking for the motion. Aved, are you there?
Yep.
Right. So you have 4 minutes on the clock. The floor is yours.
Okay, so firstly, Yash kept talking about how some people, due to certain technicalities in the law, were allowed out of prison and allowed back into society. And he used this as a justification for the death penalty. Sir, I fail to understand how this is a call for the institution of the death penalty rather than a call for fixing loopholes in the law. If there are such issues in the law, then they should be fixed. That's not a reason to institute the death penalty. Now, a lot of the opposition has brought up this argument that if someone has killed or someone has committed a heinous crime, then they deserve to be killed in return or as punishment. Sir, our criminal justice system is not based on the concept of revenge. It is based on the concept of punishment and based on the concept of justice. If someone goes and robs someone else's house, you don't go and rob the house of the criminal. You give them a different punishment. That's not the way our criminal justice system works. Now, a lot of the opposition again has come up with this argument that the use of the capital punishment is more humane than solitary confinement or other forms of punishment. Sir, taking away someone's fundamental right to their life in no way, shape, or form can be more humane than allowing them their right to live. There is no humane way to kill someone. Giving someone an injection which is going to take away their life, making someone go to the gallows, making someone hang is not more humane in any way, shape, or form than keeping them in prison for the rest of their lives. Sir, I would argue that the way that the institution of the death penalty is actually so inhumane that it should not be allowed to continue in the future. Furthermore, there is no logical reason to apply the death penalty rather than keep someone in prison for the rest of their lives, because the usage of the death penalty does not deter crime in any way, shape, or form. The usage of the death penalty is not linked to any sort of decrease in the crime. There is no credible research showing that the death penalty deters crime. Furthermore, the opposition seem to believe that appeals, reviews, petitions, or whatever methods of oversight they have will stop the miscarriage of law, and that no innocent person will be executed as a result, as a wrongful conviction because of the variety of safeguards which are in place. Sir, I don't subscribe to this idea of a utopian world where the criminal justice system is so perfect that it can never make any sort of errors. Sir, of every 10 people in America who are executed since 1973, one of them have been proved innocent. So when you understand the concept of irreversibility with regard to the death penalty in the way the criminal justice system functions in the modern society, it is not possible to have absolute perfect judgments irrespective of how many appeals, reviews, or whatever you may have. Lastly, the institution of the death penalty is more expensive than the institution of keeping someone in prison for the rest of their lives. It keeps an unnecessary burden on the criminal justice system as a result of the constant appeals and the long drawn out nature of the process, and the racial and economic discrimination in the application of the death penalty is absolutely certainly something we need to take into account. Studies have shown that black persons living in Florida, those who kill white people are 40 times more likely, or nearly 40 times more likely, to be sentenced to death than those who kill African Americans. So there is a fundamental economic as well as racial discrimination in the application of the death penalty.
Wrap up.
In my speech.
Yeah. Thank you. I think we'll take questions from first. We'll take a question from Richik, move further down to Yash, and then to Shinjoy.
Your mic's muted.
Yeah. So, thank you for your speech, sir. Now, sir, you mentioned that you do not believe in a system where there are no fallacies, right? You said that in your speech. But, sir, given that circumstance in the real world, don't you believe that it is better to implement something like the death penalty which has lesser scope of error as compared to something as lifetime imprisonment, wherein the perpetrators can easily evade such a form of punishment, as has been pointed out by the opposition numerous times.
Sir, I didn't understand. Could you just repeat that a bit
Yeah.
once?
Sir, you said that you believe in that there is no system which does not have a fallacy, right? Now, with that statement, don't you think it is better to implement something like the death penalty, which has lesser scope for error, as compared to something like lifelong imprisonment, which the perpetrators can easily evade, as has been brought up by several opposition arguments?
Sir, I don't understand how the death penalty has a lesser scope for error than life in imprisonment. But leaving for that, that's for firstly that. Additionally, sir, when you're giving someone life in prison, you always have the opportunity to reverse that sentence and allow them back into society. But as soon as you implement the death penalty, they're dead. They cannot be re-implemented. They cannot be released back into society. So if there is an error with the death penalty, then there is no way you can reverse it. That's my entire point.
Right. Thank you for the question, Richik. Thank you, Ave. We'll take the next question now from Yash.
Thank you, moderator. First of all, Avya, you stated that you took examples from my speech and then said that instead of you suggested we should fix the loopholes that allow these people to be removed. However, I never used the word loopholes in my speech for the simple reason that these aren't really loopholes. They're just technicalities that can be misused. And these are technicalities that you cannot remove from the legal system. For example, Catherine Wood, the first
Yash,
example that I used
a
in my speech.
question, not an explanation.
Yes, it's a question. Please wait for the question. And so basically, Catherine Wood that I used in my speech was released because she was deemed mentally unsound when she committed the crime. However, this is a technicality and not a loophole, and removing this from the legal system would result in much greater, much more unjust rulings than the current scenario. And therefore, why do you think that these are loopholes that can be fixed, and how do you suggest that any solution other than implementing the death penalty could solve these problems?
Sir, the presence of technicality in law is always is something that can always be reformed. If there is a technicality in the law and it is being misused in a particular way, then there can always be reforms or amendments to that technicality or to that specific law which ensure that it is not misused. Furthermore, this is not the presence of technicalities in law cannot be an argument for the implementation of the death penalty. That's because if you allow the death penalty to continue and you allow innocent people to die, or even people to die irrespective of whether they're innocent or guilty, it doesn't make sense to me. I believe that the death penalty is already too inhumane as a punishment to be implemented.
Right. Yash,
So follow up. So one line follow up.
is it another question, or is it a counter argument or a refutation or something along
It's
those
a
lines?
refutation, sir.
Right. Go ahead.
So your entire argument, currently stated and in your speech, was about the implementation of the death penalty, not the fundamental concept of the death penalty and as a whole. So how would you be opposed to not complete abolition and a moratorium instead?
Sir, in my speech, I specified that the use of capital punishment is inhumane. The concept of the death penalty can never be more humane than any other sort of punishment. I consider it to be at a point of inhumanity that it cannot be implemented, or it should not be implemented in our society. That is something I specified in my speech. That is one of my arguments, sir.
Right. That's it. We won't be moving down this line any further. We had, I think, one more question from Shinjoy, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. Am I audible?
Yes.
Right. So in the beginning of your speech, you talked about how technicalities in the prison system, how technicalities in the justice system should be modified such that people do not have the chance to escape on these technicalities. But sir, at the same time, you do not seem to be inclined to modify or reform any technicalities or any loopholes in the death penalty system. So sir, why do you have this different attitude towards the modifying of technicalities, or towards the modifying or towards the modifying of technicalities, right?
Sir, my argument with regard to technicalities in I'm not talking about technicalities in the implementation of the death penalty, but my argument with regard to that was there's no amount of oversight or no amount of appeal that can guarantee that someone is absolutely guilty, and that the presence of the death penalty is already open to misuse. The way the death penalty is set up in law, it can easily be it is uh, it can it can and it is in a variety of situations applied to people who are not guilty. And I believe that in addition to I believe that non people who are innocent as well as people who are guilty, but obviously especially people who are innocent, should not be subjected to something as inhumane as the death penalty.
All right. On that note, I don't think we have any further questions. Do the judges have a question?
Yeah, I'll ask a question. Web, thank you for your speech. Okay, I have a very simple clarification. You say that justice is not about revenge. When someone robs your house, you do not go and rob that person's house. Just one sentence of context and then my question. Given that justice or criminal system or any, like the state, tries to maintain the faith of the people it sort of promises to protect, tell me the problem with revenge, in this case, death or death penalty as a form of revenge being a form of justice. What do you think? What is your opinion on why revenge cannot be a form of justice?
Sir, I believe that when we are implementing the concept of justice, our prison system is supposed to be, our prison system and our criminal justice system has is required to punish and cause the perpetrators to repent, and not to carry out upon the perpetrators what they have done. If someone has carried out a heinous crime, I agree, they should be punished. But I'm saying that firstly, they don't need to be subjected to exactly what they did to the other person. And in addition to that, if they have killed someone else, I believe that they still should not be killed, because I don't believe that.
I get that. Why? I'm sorry to interject. Why? I just want to know why you think it's problematic to kill someone in retortion to that person killing someone. X person kills Y. Y's family members go and kill X. That justice. What do you think is the problem for that? With that?
So I don't believe that the criminal justice system should have the right to determine who has the right to live and who does not deserve the right to live.
All right.
Thank you. Yeah, that's
all right. All right. So I think we'll move on to the last speaker, excluding the fact that Parikshit and Pranit have the time reserved. And this person is Av's teammate, Shinjoy Sen. Shinjoy, are you ready?
Right. Am I audible?
Yes. So you have 4 minutes and your time starts now.
Right. So taking into consideration the argument that no amount of appeal can actually guarantee that no innocence will be punished, which seems to be a primary premise for the arguments for each and every member who has spoken for the motion today, ladies and gentlemen, understand that that is simply not a plausible argument, because we have to consider the safeguards in the Indian justice system today. Understand that firstly, in the trial courts, when someone is given a death sentence, from there might be an appeal in the High Court. From the High Court, the appeal might go to the Supreme Court, and if even the Supreme Court determines the death sentence is necessary, in that case, the final verdict rests with the president. So, ladies and gentlemen, understand if so many safeguards exist, and if in each trial there are more than one judge, there's more than one judge sitting for these trials, we cannot simply say that this system is unreliable. Because, ladies and gentlemen, understand that if we say that okay, no amount of appeal can guarantee that innocence will not be punished, so don't give them death penalty, so then why punish them at all? If you feel that if you feel that there is a scope for a 0.0005% error, so you do not want to give them punishment, so then do not punish them, and that goes completely against every, then that will completely abolish the criminal justice system itself. Also, ladies and gentlemen, understand that we keep talking about loopholes, we keep talking about loopholes in technicalities, but ladies and gentlemen, understand that so many safeguards already exist, and in spite of that, we can further modify. Because understand, for example,
I request you to just wrap it up there.
Wrap it up.
I'm sorry. Continue. I'm sorry.
Right. So, like considering
My bad.
right. So when we're talking about flaws, so consider that there's always the opportunity to reform these very laws. Now, understand that every speaker or side proposition seems to be completely open to reforming any such technicalities, any such reform, any such loopholes present in solitary confinement, any loopholes present in confinement for life, but they do not have the inclination to work towards the giving of capital punishment. Understand that when we look at the third speaker who spoke for the motion, he said that it will not actually, when I brought up the question about how the criminal how purpose of the criminal justice system is actually giving justice to the victim, he said that once a person has been murdered or raped, it no longer matters to him, and we have to make sure the person who's done it has repented. Now that is completely fallacious. Understand, if in a hypothetical world a person who has been raped actually does not care, then firstly he or she would not file an FIR against the perpetrator. Secondly, he or she would not actually go to the court as a witness, as the as the prosecutor. So in that case, there will be no court case at all, and therefore that is completely fallacious, completely redundant. That's a completely redundant argument. Now, about people having about the people who have brought up that it is more expensive to actually give capital punishment because it is a long run process, I do not understand whether they do not grasp the fact that if you actually give uh, life imprisonment to a person, in that case you are taking responsibility to feed that person for the rest of his life. If he has an illness, it is your responsibility to treat that illness. So how is that costing less money than giving a capital punishment? That simply escapes me. Now, there has been talk about whether psychological balances, there might be mistakes because a person who is of unsound mind can be convicted under the system. Again, ladies and gentlemen, I must bring up the safeguards that are already prevalent and understand that if, according to the Constitution of India, by which these court cases are argued, remember that these
Shouldn't I
court
wrap up?
oh right concluding statement, remember that these court cases are not arbitrary. So understand that if unsound mind is felt as a plausible defense by the judges in any of the layers of the safeguards, then it will simply be overturned. Considering so many safeguards at present, we simply
That's
cannot
it.
say.
That's it.
Right.
Yeah. I think we'll be moving on to questions now. We'll start with Shomajyoti, move on to Pranav, and then to Abhay.
All right, so as you mentioned in your speech, since you are speaking against the motion, and you clearly mentioned about, in your speech that, of course, a lifelong imprisonment makes costs more because it involves taxpayers' money into feeding someone and also keeping him alive in case of any illness. Since it's at the end of the day lifelong imprisonment. So, sir, do you not think, as also member one of the speakers of the proposition mentioned earlier, do you not think that in cases of capital punishment or death penalty, even in, you mentioned about errors, right? So in case there is even 1% error, it is an irreversible process. It cannot be undone. What is done once the life of a person has been taken, it cannot be restored. Whereas in lifelong imprisonment, it has often happened before that years after the person has served in jail, years after the person has served in prison, he has been proved to be innocent. Till then his case was going on in court, but he was in police custody. So, and then he has been proved innocent and being released. So do you not think that it's quite unjustified for him to be killed for,
Right.
if in case he's
Thank you,
innocent,
sir.
in cases of capital
Thank you, sir.
punishment or
And
death penalty?
I understand your example. So let us actually try to analyze this example that you have provided us. According to you, while the case is going on, the said person is in police custody and he has been proven innocent and he is let go. Fair enough. Now understand that while this case is going on, the person will not be given capital punishment. To be given capital punishment, the case needs to actually finish. Now understand that under the legal principle that a person cannot be punished twice for the same crime, understand that once the case is over, that is the entire system of appeals is
Double
over. uh, Once the entire system of appeals is over, there is no further scope for further appeals once even the president is denied, and in that case there is no scope for him being let out later. So considering that, there is your entire the entire fallacy of your example lies in the fact that in your example he's being proven innocent while the court case is still going on, and therefore that example simply does not stand in this situation.
That will be denied. I'm sorry. I think his answer was quite clear over there.
Just one line on his answer, just a term he mentioned probably.
Is it a refutation?
Just clarification, not even a question.
Is it a refutation?
No, not exactly. It's a refutation, but not exactly a separate
Shomajyoti,
question.
see,
Yeah.
I don't like. See, the thing is that towards the end, when we have one more thing, let's keep the comments for that. Because if you give a clarification, it
Okay,
we're not marking.
Yeah,
exactly.
there'll be too much discourse over there. So, I think we'll take the next question now. It's from Pranav.
Hey, Shomajyoti, Mike. I hope before my question, I hope the judges will note the grave misuse of a quotation from my speech, where the speaker said, "I quote unquote do not care about the victim." But my question is based on that. So, Shinjoy, thank you for your speech. I would like to, I'd like to address the question where once a person has committed a crime and is convicted, right? After that, the punishment incurred on the person cannot directly affect the victim. The question over here in discussion is what punishment should be given to the victim and why. So why is it that capital punishment, because you have repeatedly said it is better justice to the victim itself, why is it that capital punishment is better justice to a victim when that is not even any question in the first place, and why not isolatory confinement?
Right. So again, in your question, what you said was after the case is done, the punishment that is given does not affect the victim. Is that right? Just clarify it for me once. Clarify.
I said it does not directly affect the victim. Right. That's what I said.
Right. So understand, ladies and gentlemen, that the fact that a victim is taking a person to court means he is directly interested in what is the outcome of that court trial. Now, whether that is having a physical effect on his life, an economical effect on his life, or a psychological effect on his life is not in purview. Understand may simply have a psychological effect on his life, where I might be happy that the victim has been the perpetrator has been given the appropriate punishment, and that might be simply a psychological benefit, but it is for that very peace of mind that I am taking the person to court. Understand that the very reason that there have been so many protests against the delay of capital punishments in the recent case is that it is affecting the victim psychologically if he feels that proportionate justice as is deserved is not meted out to the perpetrator.
Right. Thank you.
Never mind.
Right. We will now continue to the question from Ava and then move on to the judges if they have a question.
Sir, my question is again regarding the safeguards you mentioned. So, considering the fact that the safeguards against the miscarriage of justice are all based on human judgment, considering the fact that human judgment is fallible, how can you say that these safeguards are completely absent from failure and these safeguards can never fail?
Right. So these safeguards are put in place because human judgment is fallible, right? It is on the premise that human judgment is fallible that the that the lawmakers believed that one judge might be wrong, but the chances for multiple judges being wrong on the same case are absolutely negligible. But so in spite of that, if you feel that there might be a fallacy, say after all the trials, each and every judge in each and every trial have got it wrong, which seems to me a very hypothetical and very arbitrary and unrealistic situation. But in that situation, they could have gotten it long for a lifelong punishment also. They could have gotten it long for a case regarding a simple fine also, because understand that the very reason that these safeguards have been put are to prevent one judge, two judge, to prevent these judges from getting it wrong. The more the judges look at the case, the lesser the percentage chance of such a fallacy in their judgment.
Right. So I think
May I follow
we'll. No, I think. Is it a refutation or is it another question?
It's just a follow up to his answer.
No, let's not do that. Let's not do that.
All right. So I think with that we'll take a question from the judges if they have one. Otherwise, move on to the final two speakers.
I don't have one.
Right.
What about you, Andrew?
No, I'm good. I don't have a question.
All right. So I think all that's left for us now is to wrap up the two speeches from Parikshit and Praneeth. So we'll start with Praneeth. Praneeth had
Before that, I have a question. So this
right.
time's also getting marked, right? It's not
Yeah,
just
yeah.
a wrap-up speech.
All of this is all the questions, answers, and speeches. The moderator's questions, all of it is marked. Praneeth had 2 minutes remaining in his speech, which will be his time to ideally refute the points made. Praneeth, you have 2 minutes, and yeah, the floor is yours.
As the final speaker of the proposition today, it is my burden to frame the debate and prove to you why side proposition has won. Now, firstly, I completely negate the last speech made by Srinjoy, which posits that their safeguards exist within the Indian legal system, because side proposition has already demonstrated to you that despite safeguards, despite the existence of safeguards in one country or another, this has still led to the rise of mistakes and several miscarriages of justice, as can be easily sourced on the internet, and I do not need to state again to flesh out my argument. Now considering the fact that, as to quote Yash himself, the room for error is huge. To place this quote in a different context, the criminal justice system has its deficits, and this is agreed to on both sides of the house. And because of these deficits, which include the lack of the unavailability of legal resources to certain groups and poor people, as mentioned by me, or the natural economic and social bias against, say, black people in Florida, as mentioned by Avyay, these deficits have led to disproportional treatment of punishment and further miscarriages of justice. And thus, considering that the death penalty is irreversible and does not provide any room for, say, reformation or the reversal of these mistakes, we believe that it should be reformed. Now, for moving on to a very important argument, no one on the opposition has proved that the death penalty is a necessary moral repercussion to what they measure as grave crimes. And furthermore, in their moral paradigm, the loss of innocent lives is taken as necessary collateral damage to the existence of the legal system. We do not believe that this is a proper moral paradigm, and we posit that and a punishment such as solitary confinement, lifetime solitary confinement, would serve the same moral purposes of justice, and it has the provision of being reversible, and this outweighs the pros provided by them legally speaking. And further to refute Richik's speech, where he talked about natural justice,
your time is up.
One line. In the sense that Richie talked about this is a system in which public support for an execution, which is often based on a very primal eye for an eye basis, actually outweighs legal constructs of human rights and their existence.
All right, that's it. Thank you. I'd like to request Parikshit also during his speech to refrain from exceeding the time bar as well. So with that in mind, we'll take 2 questions from the floor and 1 from the judges. So I think, seeing as there are only 2 hands up, we'll take 1 from Yash and then move on to Richik and see if the judges have something to say.
So the beginning of the speaker's speech spoke about safeguards being placed in India and how this is not true for the entire world. But and then he spoke about his examples from his first speech. However, I would like to point out that all of his examples from the United States where safeguards are not present, and where safeguards are present, for example, India, not a single miscarriage of justice has been carried out in case of the death penalty. So does the speaker not believe that these safeguards can simply be other countries can also take inspiration from these safeguards and therefore implement them and a better practice to the death penalty than abolishing the death penalty universally and absolutely?
Well, what you're arguing for here is essentially an improvement to the current criminal justice system as it exists, and as you agree, will lead to further losses of innocent lives if it is not reformed. However, we posit that the abolishment of this system is a better alternative, because of the simple reason that as long as the death penalty exists and allows for these mistakes and these miscarriages of justice to be made, I suggest to you that since the opposition has not provided any concrete measures for how the how the criminal justice system can be improved, besides say taking example from a case like India, where perhaps the absence of miscarriages of justice is due to the fact that the criminal justice system is lazy. The opposition has not considered such reasons for explaining why there are so little, why there have only been 5 examples, why there have only been 5 cases of the death penalty since 1995. It has not considered other reasons than the fact that perhaps the Indian legal system is perfectly efficient.
Right, right. Thank you. Yash, is that a refutation?
Yes, so a refutation to what you just said.
All right.
So you say that the opposition has not considered any other examples of legal reforms. However, speakers of the opposition and the judges have proposed I'm sorry, I forget the word, a moratorium on the death penalty, which is different from an abolishment or abolition, and is a legal reform that keeps the death penalty present. However, also cures most of the problems that we have with the death penalty, and all 5 of your examples.
Yeah, so considering the fact that I've already mentioned moral reasons for the abolishment of the death penalty, such as the fact that it is irreversible, that it then becomes the burden of the opposition to pose a similar moral or legal reason as to why the death penalty should persist even in moratorium, which the opposition has not fulfilled.
Right. Thank you, Pranit. Yash, I think we'll take the last question on the speech now from Rishik. 1 second, Richard. Your mic, yeah.
Yeah. So, Pranit, you mentioned in your repetition of my speech, you said how natural justice is more promoted by public opinion, right? However, when you talk about granting the capital punishment to a particular individual, it is in fact done through a lot of scrutiny and a lot of legal processes and appeals, which does not involve the public as a whole. Moreover, you spoke of socio-economic differences. However, when it comes to cases involving life imprisonment, right, those cases are fought over a period of like 30 years, where funds are exhausted and the people who fall on the lower side of the socioeconomic caste cannot afford them. Wherein, when it comes to capital punishment, the burden of providing a lawyer for fighting a case falls on the state itself in several countries. So, what would your response to that be?
My response to the first part of the question is the very fact that although it may not be direct, although your idea of natural justice in the sense that you have used is not a direct involvement of the public on that part. The very reason you pose this idea in your speech, from the word in your speech, as I have understood it, is the fact that it allows for this bloodthirsty instinct of an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth, which allows for the public to kill a person which has taken another innocent life. We do not believe that any further moral justification of this has been provided. We believe that this system has led to mistakes. We believe that referring to the second part of your counter question, we believe that the persistence of these court cases pertaining to lifetime solitary confinement persisting over 30 years is not an adequate rebuttal as to why do you want to do away with lifetime solitary confinement as the punishment. Is that what you're suggesting?
Right. Okay, so
Suryansh,
yeah,
given that a question was posed to me, can there be a
sure. Keep it as short as you can, please. We're at having time constraints.
Yeah, definitely. So one idea behind behind bringing up the 30-year long trials was that simply because of the fact that these cases with lifetime imprisonment and these long drawn out cases actually take more of a toll on the victims rather than the practice of capital punishment. Right? It, in fact, grants justice quicker and is in fact a more efficient way of granting justice as compared to these long drawn out processes.
Yeah, so the implication is that you want to replace cases where the possible punishment is lifetime solitary confinement with the death penalty. You wish to implement the death penalty uniformly. That is the only logical implication of that argument.
Right.
May I?
What?
May I just clarify?
That way. I don't think that's required. I think the judges have heard what they've had to hear, and I think it will only lead to further discourse, which I don't think is required at this point. So I think the judges, do you all have anything to question or comment?
I'm good. Altamash.
I'm good too.
Right. Seeing as there are no questions, we'll move on to the final speaker for the evening, which is Parikshit. Parikshit, you had a minute and 30 seconds left for your speech. So, are you ready?
Yes.
Okay. So, you have a minute and 30 seconds. Your time starts now.
Right. So in today's debate, the proposition has consistently come and told us that there is a need for reformation, which was especially exemplified by Avyar. Now, what we must realize at this point of time is that in my very first speech, right at the beginning, I gave the option to the entire House about whether or not the convict himself should have the ability to decide between hard labor for life the or the death penalty. And therefore, the question that have been brought up by the proposition itself about who decides whether the person should be having the right to live or not, that gets solved by that when the convict himself gets to decide between those two options. And since the entire proposition has not addressed that contention of mine, which was placed up right at the beginning of the debate, I take it that they agree with it, and therefore that is a valid justification to prove that the death penalty should not be abolished. At the same point of time, what we must realize is that, let us take the example of the NKVD agents that worked in the 1930s in the United States of America, where certain agents were convicted of killing federal agents of the FBI and they were sentenced to death. However, they were kept in imprisonment till the time of their death, and between that time and when the death penalty was executed, they escaped and went out to kill further more agents. And that is again proof that if we keep them in imprisonment, there is a very high chance of them escaping and committing the same crime yet again. At the same point of time, it is very shocking that the proposition today is so cruel that they can say that the convicts, while them being human beings themselves, do not deserve any level of humaneness. That is making them and keeping them at the same
Parikshit, wrap up.
these criminals and these criminal minds. There are the people who are the ones who actually go ahead and commit such crimes that deserve the death penalty.
That's it. Okay. Thank you, Parikshit.
Right.
We'll now we'll be taking two questions from the floor and then see if the judges have anything to say. So does anyone have a question? Right. So we'll first take a question from Pranav and then move on to Shomojyoti. Yeah. And that's it.
We apologize for missing your proposition, but sir, do you really believe it is logical to, keeping in mind that capital punishment is incurred by a criminal only due to the gravest of crimes, right? That is well understood. So, do you believe it is logical to provide a criminal of that order a choice in his own punishment in our legal system? Just a very simple answer to that question.
Right. So since in today's debate itself, the primary contention has been whether or not we give someone the solitary confinement or whether or not we give them the death penalty. Now, the basic contention of side proposition today has been that who decides whether a person is allowed to die or not. In this regard, since you do ask me this question, at this point of time, it is decided by the court itself. So now you're just contradicting the arguments that have been presented by Avyay from your side itself, where he questioned that why should one person get the entire liberty to decide this. So in response to that, there is a possibility of reformation in this case, where both sides can come to a mutually agreeable conclusion, and then there could be reformation instead of complete abolition of the punishment.
Right. I think that answer is pretty clear to you. We'll now take the final question, which is from Shomojyoti. Yeah.
So, sir, in your speech, you gave an example of people who were first put in prison for a number of years before they were about to be, for a time interval before they were about to be executed or given capital punishment or death penalty, and during that period they were successful in escaping the prison. Now considering your own example, do you think that a government or a country in which law and order is inefficient enough to prevent people from escaping or breaking out of prison, do you feel that government or law and order in that country is competent enough to correctly and legitimately assess a case of death penalty? Like, what if there is an error and then since it's an irreversible process, life cannot be restored to that person?
Right. So when we're comparing these two things, when we're talking about the security of a prison, and then when we're comparing whether or not the legal justification of a certain punishment exists, they're completely two different facets altogether. On one hand, we're comparing the intellectual ability of the population, of the civilization, of the country, of the judges to decide whether or not that person should get a punishment or not. And on the other hand, we're talking about the security of a prison, which is completely different. The reason why the person was able to escape was the use of force. That he had an entire team, which was the entire Russian government, that could come behind it, create and hatch a plot that could lead to the escape. So that again comes down to the security measures of a prison, and has nothing to do with passing judgment, which is done in a courthouse by people who are using their minds and not their bodies to physically restrain somebody.
Just a small plea to follow up. Just a line. Just a line. Okay. Suryansh, am I allowed to do that? Just one line. Hello.
Suryansh,
Suryansh.
you in here?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Is it
Suryansh,
is it another question or?
Not at all. Not at all. Not at all. Just a line. The speaker need not answer after that.
All right. Go ahead.
Yes. So, sir, death penalty, that is capital punishment or hanging of a person, done in court, or is it done by jailer in some prison or an open area or a specific area? Just a clarification. According to is the death penalty or capital punishment given in court?
We get the
A person who has to break out can break out even from there.
I get it.
That's what I want.
Okay.
Right. So again, as per
Parikshit.
that contention that a person who, yes, sir.
Yeah, I don't think Suryash, do you want him to engage with that? I think that was just a statement.
I think I don't. I think and like note that it's the judges are also watching, so they see the point here, so they'll be marking accordingly.
Fair
So
enough.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
So Parikshit, this is more than a question; it's a clarification regarding the first thing that you just said. Are you proposing a sort of an arbitration or an understanding between a criminal and a victim or the family of the victim? Because when you say that, they understand, they will come together, you'll have the other person reform. Is it some sort of an arbitration that
I don't understand that I have not spoken about the family of any of the
not the family.
convicts
You
in
said
any
that,
point.
they'll come together, they'll sit together and, they will sort of move on, like, give the other person a chance to reform. So are you sort of trying to say that there'll be some sort of a settlement or an arrangement which will
No,
help
sir.
the person?
So when I was talking about the reformations, that was specifically to the contention of the proposition that the court does not have the ability or does not have the authority to actually decide whether or not a person should be let to live. So in response to that, it was something which I suggested right at the beginning of the debate as the first speaker, that if that is a possible contention for the proposition, then there could also be a possible reformation that says that, okay, there could be an option. So like till the 1990s in the United States of America, it was allowed for the convict to decide whether that person gets the firings, whether that person gets the lethal injection, or whether they get the electrical chair. So that sort of an option could also be given. Do you want the solitary confinement with hard labor for your entire life, or do you want the death penalty? Which do you think is better? You could have that choice because
I think he sees
happen
the
to be
point.
very of the same magnitude.
Thank you, Parikshit. All right, now that that's been done, everyone has spoken and asked questions. I think we'll now be moving on to the last segment of this debate, which is the question to the House. Now, the judges, I think Indrajeet has come up with.
Just interject for a second.
Yes.
We wait for a second. Srinjoy, just let me call Srinjoy. He's left. I'll call him back.
Right. All right. So we're now going to be moving on to the question to the House. I believe Indrajeet and Altamash have come up with a question they would like to propose. Over to Indrajeet.
Just to go over this again, 90 seconds, 2 questions in front of you. Just clarify before you begin answering which question you're answering. We do not really care about what your stance was. We want to know what your opinion is on that issue. Without further ado, the first question is, why is death penalty just or unjust?
Okay.
And the second question is, should a convict's economic and cultural background be a factor while determining whether he should be given a death penalty? Okay? I'll repeat it. Question 1 hai, why is death penalty just or unjust?
We can send it on a chat, right?
Sorry.
We can send both the questions to them on chat.
We'll send it on chat.
I think they're pretty simple.
We'll still send it so that you have that reference point. And the second one is, should a convict's economic and cultural background be a factor while determining death penalty?
Right.
Just a clarification, if I may.
Yeah.
Yeah. So is there provision as in like if you want to answer both or something?
How
Or
about, how about
Sure, man.
we have 90 seconds, right?
Yeah.
So we might as well be able to answer both if we'd like.
Okay.
Yeah, sure.
Great. Thank you. Okay.
Okay, so I think we'll start with seeing as Shinjoy is having some network issues. We'll start with Abhay. Yeah, Abhay. So as you
Could I first just get this the questions on the chat, then I'll respond to them.
yeah, sure.
Smart, very smart.
All right, so Abhay, you have the questions now. Before we start, do you want to answer both questions or do you want to choose one?
I'll answer the question, why is the death penalty just or unjust, and then I'll move on to the second one is more of a comment. I'll
All right.
Yeah,
So
let's stick to time
the
limits,
judges
yeah?
will mark you on what
Yeah,
you say.
let's
Anyway,
stick to 90 seconds.
okay.
all right.
So when we're talking about the death penalty, I believe that the concept of the death penalty itself is unjust, because I don't believe that the decision as to whether someone has the right to live or does not deserve the right to live should be in the hands of the court or in the hands of anyone except that person. A person cannot be forced to die. If someone has committed a heinous crime, I get it, they should be punished to of the full extent of the law, but you can't give them the death penalty, because the court should not have the right or the ability to determine who deserves to live and who doesn't deserve to live. And coming to the question whether a convict's economic and cultural background should be a factor when determining whether that death penalty should be given out to him, again, I'm principally opposed to the concept of the death penalty. So that question renders itself redundant, because I don't believe the death penalty should be given out in any case. Forget so the convict's economic and cultural background is irrelevant in this case. But when we're giving someone the death penalty, you have to understand that when someone comes into this world, the most basic and most fundamental right they have is the right to live, and this right cannot be taken away from them by anyone. That's my stance.
Thank you, Abhay. Next up is Yash.
Yeah. So I would like to first answer the question, why is the death penalty just or unjust, and then move on to my answer for the second. So firstly, I'd like to state, in accordance with my stance also, I believe that the death penalty is very much just. We must understand that for any just practice, there can be unjust practices of the same principle. However, in its best practice, the death penalty is in fact just, because I don't see it as taking a life. I see it as saving many more lives. Because once you establish a death penalty, it is not only a deterrent force to other people trying to conduct crimes as heinous as that, but it is also a force that stops those people from committing those crimes again. As I've already pointed out the examples, the death penalty in many cases could have saved several lives if it was implemented. Moving on to the second question, I believe that whether or not a death penalty should be given out to a person depends on a lot of factors. However, the cultural and economic background of the convict should not be one of them, because there are several other factors that should also be considered that are much, much more grave. That even if these were valid logical factors, there are much more grave factors. For example, determining whether someone is guilty to such a degree that to such a surety that they can be given a death penalty is in itself a task, and therefore things like cultural and economic background are too futile to be in the question at all for something as grave and as extreme as the death penalty.
All right, that was your statement, Yash. We'll move on to the next one. Seeing as Shinjoy has...
Let him go last. Shinjoy, let's not disturb the order. Yeah?
Okay.
Excuse
Can I begin?
Yeah.
So, is someone else talking?
Shinjoy is talking.
Right. So I have a request. Like I had to leave because of internet problems. Could you please explain once what?
So, Suryanj, why don't you?
Yeah, right. So what this segment is just a question that's proposed to the floor.
I've sent it to him.
Altamash and Indrajeet had given two questions to the floor a short while ago, and you have to answer. You can answer either one or both questions over a 90-second period. They will. You don't have to necessarily stick to your stances. It is a general way for both Altamash and Indrajit to judge your stance and just propose ideas, etc.
Right.
Right. So,
Want to continue?
yeah, continue. You have a minute and
Right. So, contrary to how solid the stance of proposition was, obviously there are two sides to this picture. When you're deciding whether it's just or unjust, it's very tough to give one side the ball altogether. What I'd say is if you consider both sides together, right? For proposition for this opposition against this, their reasoning is that the punishment must be given in a certain way to these people. The thing is that there are alternatives to that punishment, right? And what our goal should be is to work on those alternatives because those are being exploited to let these people go. What proposition is saying is that irreversibility, there is no alternative that can help that, the death penalty. So even if it's 1 out of 100, forget 1 out of 10, even if it's 1 out of 100, you are still killing an innocent person. So it when you weigh them both together, you feel like it is possible to work on the alternative, that is isolatory confinement, maybe work on trying to seal off those loopholes rather than have the death penalty, because no matter how much you perfect it, there is no such thing as absolute perfection. So 1 out of 100 people will be innocent and you will have taken their life and you simply cannot give it back to them. Secondly, when you come to the economic and cultural background of a person, it is obviously a very it is an idealistic concept. It is a utopian concept rather, because when you put that into perspective, obviously you would like to give the person the benefit of the doubt. If they are illiterate or if they come from a very suppressed background, they are subject to more stress. It is bound to have more of an impact on them. But
Pranav, wrap up.
yeah, just a second. When you take all of these things into consideration, if you try and provide them if you try and provide them a more equal field, this opens a whole other array of loopholes. And in best interest of majority, I feel it would be best to keep the practice uniform. That is what I would
Right.
think. It is not pushed. If it is
Right.
not.
Thank you, Pranav. I think we'll move on to the next one now, which is Richik. Richik, you have a minute and 30 seconds, and your time starts now. Richik, your mic. Richik, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can
So
restart.
when we talk about capital punishment being just or unjust, we have to deal with this with two different perspectives. Firstly, when we talk about crimes like, for example, drug trafficking or murder or sexual assault, in such cases, the death penalty might seem admissible, right? But when you talk about, for example, in countries like Iran, in countries like China, or even and several other states in the Middle East, what they do is even a person shifting from his original Islamic faith is considered something that is worthy of awarding the death penalty, right? However, in such a scenario, it is completely a person's choice what faith they want to follow. So in such a situation, the death penalty is in fact quite extreme and is suppressing individualism in a country, right? Now, talking about the second question, the socioeconomic background. Now, what we need to keep in mind is this sort of a distinction should not be made while the punishment is being meted out. However, when we talk about responsibility of the person who is the perpetrator, responsibility of the families of the perpetrator, that falls upon the state, right? For example, if the only earning member of a particular family has been subjected to that penalty, now it is under the responsibilities of the state that they look to the needs of this particular family that has lost a member to the death
Right,
penalty.
Richard, wrap up.
The only earning member. So yeah, that's pretty much it.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. I think we'll now take a statement from Shomashati on these questions. You have a minute and 30 seconds.
All right, so I'll answer the second question first, that whether a person's social, economic, and cultural background should be considered while giving him towards his criminal proceedings or giving him death penalty or capital punishment. Now, first of all, according to me, when a criminal performs a crime, commits a crime, a criminal doesn't estimate that person doesn't estimate his own social, economic, and cultural background before performing that crime. Secondly, that person also does not estimate the victim's social, economic, and cultural background and compares it with himself or herself and then performs that crime. So it is quite vague. For the same amplitude of criminal offense that two persons make, it is quite vague to compare the social, economic, and cultural backgrounds between the two of them, and then decide which one to give the tougher or the stricter punishment. And now what kind of punishment to be given, whether it's death penalty or it's lifelong imprisonment, that's a separate, completely different question of debate. That's a completely different topic or different matter of debate, and that's exactly where the first question comes: should death penalty is capital punishment just or unjust? And I believe it is completely unjust, because as I mentioned in my speech earlier, that capital punishment might kill you at once, but lifelong imprisonment drags a life out of you in the course of so many years. Lifelong imprisonment is any day more effective, and because it's solitary confinement, also capital punishment or death penalty doesn't
Shoma, wrap up.
give a person the chance to improve or rectify himself. And
Shoma
even
Jyoti,
if there
wrap
is
up.
1% error, that life of the person cannot be restored. Hence, it's an irreversible process. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Shoma Jyoti. With that, I think we move on to the next one, which is next speaker, which is Parikshit. Parikshit, you again, you also have another minute and a half, and
Right.
your time starts now.
Right, so I'll answer both questions together in one purview itself. So when we look at the Holocaust and the Nuremberg trials, so the people who were given the death penalty at that time were the people who were a part of the Nazi leadership, and they had the willful decision to make that they are going to go ahead and kill the Jews. And therefore, it was justice to them to go for the death penalty because of the crimes against humanity that they committed. However, when we look at the socio-economic aspect over here as well, when we look at the junior SS officers who are actually implementing these orders, and they themselves believe that yes, the Jews should be died. However, you must realize that these are ideologies that were imposed on them by the higher ups. So that gives us the idea that the socio-economic status, the rank of the individual in the hierarchical structure, gives us this incentive to realize that okay, the socio-economic structure and the position of the individual also has a greater impact onto whether or not the decision to give them the death penalty exists. And we must also realize that these criminals are people who consistently believed that even if they got out of prison, they would continue in their hatred towards the same individual.
Parikshit, wrap up.
That applies to most cases. So even when we talk about the example of when the Russian spies escaped the prison and they went on to do the same crime that they were imprisoned for, that again makes the argument that
Parikshit, your
death
time is
penalties
up.
are just more solid. Yeah.
Right. Thank you, Parikshit. With that, we'll move on to the last statement on this, on the basis of these questions. And yeah.
Second last.
Second last. I'm like second last. Apologies, I forgot about Shinjoy. Uh, yeah. So I think we'll move on to Pranit now. Pranit, you have a minute and 30 seconds. Your time starts now.
Yeah, so I, like many people, believe that every human life has innate value, right? And I believe that committing a murder does not take away that value. I believe that the psychological conditions and the various rich factors which took place in constructing a person's role as a murderer, his destiny almost, can be dissected and almost reversed. And I believe that the complexity of these factors which cause that person to carry out the murder means that that person could have been rehabilitated, right? And I believe that justice systems such as in the Netherlands, with their focus on why can I not say this word, rehabilitation, right? Pardon me. They show that committing a murder doesn't mean that you lose your right to live, right? And directly linking this to the second case, if I'm willing, what I meant by psychological conditions and the rich factors includes those economic and cultural backgrounds which a convict has, right? So I can't choose to ignore those either. By the necessity of my answer, I respond affirmatively to the second question as well. And yeah.
Yeah, right now all that's left for us to hear is Shinjoy's statement. Shinjoy, again, like the rest, you have a minute and 30 seconds. And yeah, Shinjoy, are you there?
Yes.
All right, thank you.
Am I audible?
Yes, you have a minute and 30 seconds. Your time starts now.
Right. So my point of view is that to answer these two questions, can only be done when we consider the circumstances in which the countries award the death sentence. Now, considering that this is different in different circumstances, I would like to consider these questions from the point of view of India. So, firstly, whether the death penalty is just or unjust. Now, ladies and gentlemen, understand that according to previous Supreme Court rulings, the death penalty is only to be given in the rarest of rare crimes. So, taking this on one hand, taking the other safeguards on the other hand, we can conclude that when a death penalty is given to someone who is deemed to have committed a crime which is rarest of rare crimes, it is a just and apt statement, which is a proportionate justice. Now, when we think about whether economic and cultural background should be a factor, we must actually consider what are the possible crimes for which a death penalty is meted out in India. Now, these are murder, rape, terrorism, kidnapping not resulting in death, and treason. These are some of the main crimes. Now, when we look at these crimes, for example, when we look at murder, when we look at rape, according to me, a cultural or an economic background should not be taken into consideration when judging the harshness of these crimes. Now, while I admit that there may be certain crimes to judge which you need to take these factors into account, when we see the crimes for which death penalty is awarded, the crimes which I have just read out, I believe that that economic and cultural background should
Wrap
not
up.
be a factor. So therefore, for both the questions, very objectively looking, only from the point of view of India, we see that the death penalty is a just statement and that no
Shinja, wrap up.
convicts. Right.
Right. Thank you, Shinja. With that, we've come to the end of all the statements. I think after this, we'll be back when we'll come back in a short while when the judges have tabulated their results, and we'll say a few words. Right. Um, all right. So while we tabulate the results, I think Altamash and Indrajit, I'd request you to say a few words about what you saw today to the participants.
So yeah, this is something Altamash and I was speaking about. Great speeches. We love the poise. We love the style. We love how you guys are speaking. We love the structure. How one point is coming after the other. Uh, very very shortly, I think one of the first things is that when you are debating in Oxford style, remember one thing about statistics and examples. The audience, much often even the other participants, they don't believe you when you're talking about statistics. They don't believe you when you're talking about examples, right? They don't give a fuck. Excuse my language. They really don't care, right? Which means that the moment you start rattling off, like digits and numbers, mind's off, right? So I get how you are relying on examples or how you're relying on these statistics, but make principles out of those statistics. So what I mean by that is that if you're saying that, okay, in a certain state in the United States of America, the death penalty was abolished and the crime rates went up. Do not tell me the examples that, A, B, C, D, E cases mein aisa hua tha and that is why. We don't need to know that. We need to know the principle that you have derived from those examples, or the principle that you have derived from those statistics. Because see, I'm not going to bicker with statistics. You might say 70%, somebody else might come say 45%. Abhi main us pe to nahi mark kar sakta na. The debate is that when you see the statistics, what is the principle that you've derived from it, and what is the analysis that you're giving. Now, one of the reasons why I like the completely centric to this debate, what I was thinking of is that this was for the motion, and this is something I'll bounce off. But even when you're doing Oxford, because all of you, I'm sure, will go on to debate in college, university, which will be parliamentary style. Try to understand who's the stakeholder of the debate. मतलब किसके angle से तुम ये debate कर रहे, who you are addressing from in this debate, right? Whether it is from the perspective of the state, whether it's the perspective of the judiciary, whether it's the perspective of the convict, whether it is the perspective of the society. Because you see, all these four people or these four stakeholders will entail very four different kinds of debating. Because what the judiciary might think, the legislature might not. What the legislature might think, the society might not, right? So I think that if that is clear, instead of touching on everything, you could just say that, this debate for me is about convicts and the society. Or this debate for me is about policy, which is legislature, and the society. Because at the end of the day, crime is a societal issue. And that is why you will see that in crime, the state prosecutes me. So if somebody is murdered, if I am murdered, my parents cannot go and prosecute my murderer. The state will. So it is state of West Bengal versus the murderer, right? Which means what? Crime is deemed as a wrong against the society, not against that person. So if if you bring in that kind of analysis for me, then a lot of your points that you're telling me actually stands. Then you can tell me that why it is that the society is the stakeholder, why it is right for the society to demand death even, because society is actively involved, right? Because यहाँ पे क्या हो रहा है, till the time that logical link is made for me, you are telling me the society expects this, society expects that, but I'm not getting it from your speech as to why I should care about what the society thinks, because then you're making it a judicial issue. People will run away. There are loopholes in the legal system. There are loopholes in the system how the people are kept in the jails. The convicts might murder each other and so on and so forth. And one big thing which should have come from people for the motion is that the moment you allow someone to get away by killing someone, na, जैसे अभी जो तेलंगाना में हुआ था, the rape case, the police went, they killed four. Okay? The moment you make a society addict on such immediate forms of justice, you will give the policymakers a free hand not to correct the loopholes. Because now the policymakers know कि कुछ है तो just go and hang two people and the society is satisfied. Now that becomes the norm. You see what I'm trying to tell you? Because imagine if, according to all the models that you gave me, that justice is quick, somebody is killed, within 6 months a person is killed. If the policymakers and the judiciary now see that the society is extremely happy with it, the society is in a social contract with the legislature and the judiciary, right? So if you see, if that becomes a norm where killing someone is justice, then there is no there is no other reform that you would want to undertake within the society, because you have the final solution to make the people happy. That is what I was trying to tell you guys also when I asked you that you think killing someone is justice. And for people who are saying that, people who are speaking against the motion, do not be scared in debates to take hardline stances. Logic tum banaoge, don't go by what people say. If you feel that killing is revenge is justice, say that revenge is justice. In a society where the legislature has failed us, where democracy is so complicated that they do not address the loopholes that exist, where the judiciary is now working under the legislature, where the judiciary is so tedious that convicts have so many recourses to justice that you might not even get justice. We believe that revenge is justice. Justice is deterrence. Justice is the feeling that you have not been wronged without the state taking a note. इसमें क्या होगा, the four will also think कि how will I refute that, because it's very lame for someone to come and say but ये गलत है, you can't kill someone, because you are giving logic. You're saying that when every structure has failed me, tell me why I'm wrong to say that revenge is my justice, given that maybe when a Dalit woman is raped or a Dalit household is ransacked, tell me why that duty is imposed on that Dalit household to now think no, nothing should happen to them. The court should take its stance, given that they have years and years of history of oppression. You see what I'm telling you? So if there is a hardline stance and you feel, ये logical hai, Dalit people or marginalized people or women will feel like that because of the history of oppression, just say it, analyze it for it logically. Just don't.
Can I add to that? Specifically in terms of that same argument on privilege, the other side can also argue, if privilege is so true and it is so real, how does convictions for death penalty work anyway? It is quite disproportionate to begin with. Like, for an example, most death penalties in America are against black people. Like in India too, it's against underprivileged people. Even in case of that fake encounter, think about it. People of the upper caste are not the ones that are shot down. It is always people of the lower caste or minorities to begin with. It's a very, very prejudiced mechanism to begin with. If that is true, it is not uniform punishment to begin with. And if it is not, is it fair to only tender it against certain people? Especially when you take the first speaker's argument into consideration, when he talks about how miscarriage of justice is permanent and how it's irreversible, etc. I thought a lot of arguments that came about were very nice and all of that, but I never saw the end of it or why they were logical to begin with. They were great assertions, but they were just that. Specifically in terms of that argument pertaining to how certain things are irreversible. Tell me how that machinery works. Tell me how that comes about. Or specifically how also, again, in the first speaker's argument, when he tells me how death penalty is more expensive than a lifetime imprisonment or anything along those lines. Tell me how that works about, how that comes through, because I think that's very true. It is more expensive. And if you want it to be more humane, it will be even more expensive to begin with. That's how you normalize those standards. If that is true, it's a BS punishment to have. But other than that, I thought op also really shied away from what they were doing. Like there were so many random arguments they were running in terms of how this is somehow an alternative to solitary confinement. No, they are coexisting and there are separate like hierarchies of punishment. You can perhaps argue that, like in terms of how there are certain punishments for which, okay, sure, even if you have to concede the death penalty is more inhumane than solitary confinement, then tell them, sure, some crimes are also more heinous to others. Like you can have that hierarchy created. You can only have death penalty for the worst of the worst crimes, which you already tell me. But make that into this hierarchy argument. Don't just let that go as an argument. For that, I come to my main like constructive, like framing. Like frame your arguments better. Let them lead from one to the other and make them more persuasive to that. Most of your arguments are too scattered in terms of them being too disconnected from one another. They don't need to be. Like they can come about together in terms of again this hierarchy argument pertaining to this. But you can also, if you're arguing these things, you don't need to come about with the flashiest of arguments. Like exactly what Indro says, like you don't need to come about with the arguments that sound like the most appeasing or the flashiest. You can come out with the simplest of things, like imprisoning people is too expensive too. Like prisons are overburdened right now anyway. Death penalty may like alleviate that in terms of arguing, like in terms of like that argument regarding, oh, it's more expensive to keep people in it's more expensive to tender the death penalty than it is to keep people in solitary confinement or in jail in general. Tell them, sure, that is true, but jails are overburdened. Like that does not matter. Like even if you have like the money to do it, you don't have the space to like do it. It's fine. You can have arguments that are very simple, arguments that are like just basic logic. They don't need to sound very flashy in terms of like how there are, and also in terms of your examples. Okay, you tell me about false like imprisonments or like false like death penalties in terms of specific examples. So specifically even that argument in terms of how there are people, I thought this was the most, okay, also additionally I thought this was the most intuitive thing run today, like in terms of how if you let individuals leave like prisons when there are no death penalties, they may just repeat the crimes. I thought that was very well analyzed, honestly, in my opinion. It came about very clearly. Arguments like that make so much sense and they're so simple. You don't need to go on these very jargonized, like, versions of what may or may not happen. Tell me what is already happening. But when you tell me what is already happening, there needed to be examples. They just need to be like why they happen and why they're happening. And if you can just prove that to me in a debate, that is enough, I guess. Like,
Manu Sharma and Manu Sharma is free, then Salman Khan is free, and that the Nirbhaya convicts or the people, the other people down south who were killed are not free, is the best example. Like that is an example you can just lead saying कि फिर Manu Sharma को क्यों नहीं मार रहे हो यार? Like he's a convict. But the point is that those people will never get a death penalty because the responsibility of reformation or the trust of reformation is much more higher the moment you see that okay, this person comes from privilege. So that. So I'm done. Altamash, is there?
Yeah, same. But yeah, on point. I agree with that 100%.
One thing that I want to give these debaters today is that I love the fact that you did not try to do too many things in your speeches.
I agree.
You guys had few arguments. You guys stuck to it. That's the best thing in an Oxford style. You try to do 8 things, you expose yourself to 5, right? You try to do 3 things, you build upon those 3 things. That always, I think, reaps benefits in an Oxford style of debate. Because understand there's no one following up who's going to, buttress your arguments. Even someone who's speaking for the motion after you will try to appear to be novel and someone against is trying to take it. Anyway, for me, up to Suryansha. I'm done.
But guys, like super fun as an experience for me.
Yeah,
like,
super fun.
Yeah, good work, guys.
Yeah, it was really nice. A lot of fun. Really hoping my brother doesn't qualify.
I'll tell him that.
Right. on that note, I think I think I speak for both Indrajeet and Altamash when I say that yes, it was very entertaining to watch, and I think without further ado, we'll move on to the results now. Something all the debaters have been waiting for. We'll call out the 2 qualifying teams and the speakers and the first, second, third best speakers. So we'll start with the speakers first. So all the margins between between the third, second, and first was quite a slim margin. So in third we have Ave Tulsian in the team of Shinjo and Ave, who secured the third best speaker. Congratulations to you. And in second place we had Pranav Bhandari from the team of Yash and Pranav, getting the second best speaker. And I think I'll be essentially giving away the overall best in this round by declaring this result. But Srinjoy Sen has secured the best speaker award with quite a marginal lead here. And yeah, now congratulations to all of you. Thank you to the rest of the participants for taking part. And yeah, so I think the overall results are quite evident. The two teams that have qualified are in second place. The Yash's team, and in first place, the team of Shinjoy and Avek. Congratulations to both of you. And the margins between all teams were quite close. So I'd simply like to say to all the speakers to not be disheartened, because I'd like to actually quote Yash here, who in one of our previous debates where he was judging mentioned that one debate doesn't really show your skill in the art, and there'll be many more to come, especially from this part of The Floor Is Yours. So I hope you can join us for that. So yeah, I think I'll leave you with this. Thank you all for joining, and yeah, have a nice day. See you on the next one.